Sometimes I just stop and think about how it happened. It was more a hobby than anything else, a chance to escape into fantasies where anything was possible rather than a daily grind to keep a roof over my head and food on the table. I wasn't a white-collar guy. I wasn't a lawyer or an accountant, a technology mogul, a military special forces officer who could kill you with a paperclip, or maybe a doctor. But in my imagination and in my stories, I could be all of those things and more. I started out by self-publishing on Amazon, and now I'm ashamed of how crude some of them were. When I got better and was able to pay for professional help, I pulled them out, reworked them into something digestible, and put them out again. The money I made that first year was a joke. I wasn't breaking even. Publishing was costing me more than I was making. I was about to give up when my income stream improved, and I started getting noticed. Then, I wrote a series of 4 adventure and action books that really took off. Suddenly, publishers who hadn't approached me wanted to be my new best friend. I signed with one of them on the advice of my brilliant new agent and intellectual property lawyer. There was no advance, but enough money was coming in that I could quit my regular job and focus on my new endeavor. It was a Western, and it sold well. Then I broadened my scope and wrote a novel that shot up the list like a rocket, ending up in the top 20 in several newspapers. Sunday Morning Magazine did a review and sales went up again. Then the movie people got involved, and my agent made a deal with Amazon to make a 3-part action-adventure movie. I was to get about $250,000 for each segment. My agent grinned when he saw the look on my face and said that Netflix was looking at my Western and Hollywood was watching the development of my novel, and that if it got even hotter, the offer would be in the neighborhood of 7 figures. Darla and I went from $70,000 a year together to a 7-figure income that kept growing. It didn't take much effort for me to convince her to quit her job and become one of the idle rich, or maybe just one of the idle almost rich. We bought toys. She bought a BMW convertible. I bought a new Jeep and a motorcycle. Then an opportunity came up and we bought a house on the lake. It was a clearance sale, and we got a heck of a bargain. The owners were in legal trouble and needed the money, and as fast as possible. The house was appraised at $450,000, and we got it for 3. Then Darla wanted a sailboat, even though she had no idea how to sail it. I bought a decent-sized model for the lake, and she joined the local yacht club and took lessons twice a week. I still maintained the work ethic ingrained from years of manual labor. I tried to write 6 hours a day, 5 and 6 days a week. Sometimes everything I accomplished went to waste, and sometimes everything flowed from my fingers to the keyboard. If I was on a roll, I would write for 12 hours straight. And from the outside, it might have seemed like I was throwing money around like a drunken sailor, but I wasn't that reckless. I paid cash for the lake house. Even if we never used it, the deal was too good to pass up. I knew in today's market, I could almost double my money if I had to sell. I paid cash for the cars, knowing that it wouldn't take long for them to depreciate. A new car is one of the worst investments in the world. They lose value the moment they are sold. But we had never owned anything newer than 6 years old, so we ventured out. I was surprised at how unimpressed the dealership was. People who paid cash were bad for their business because they made money off of banks, finance companies, and even insurance companies for steering the customer in their direction. My bike wasn't new, but it was worth a lot more than I paid for it, and it rode damn well and was scary fast. Next chapter, I thought I had the world by the tail, and then it all came crashing down. We were still living in our little house because we were too connected to it emotionally to leave it. It took us 5 years to save up for a down payment, and we were very lucky. We bought it when the recession hit and the housing market collapsed in the early 2000s. We paid probably 60% of what it was actually worth and worked tirelessly on it, pouring every extra penny into it. Since we now had money, we talked about expanding it, adding a bedroom or 2, and hopefully filling it to capacity. I was 33, Darla was 31, and time was running out. I worked from home in a shed I had built specifically for the purpose. It was well furnished, comfortable, and had all the comforts of an office. I told Bobby that I needed my own personal space, and it was true. I tried to work in the house, but she was always coming in and talking, sometimes seriously interfering with me. And I was especially able to get a lot done on days when I was out sailing, which is what happened today. When we spent time at the lake house, I was still working and had a small office on the first floor. I used the internet almost exclusively for research, but I had a small collection of books that helped me a lot, and I kept them. Apparently, I needed one of them for a story I was developing, and after searching the office and part of the house, It turned out that I had left it at the lake house. Since I was just going to run out to get it and come right back, I took the bike, traveling 25 miles in a surprisingly short time. Of all my toys, this one was probably my favorite. There were no cars in the driveway, but I wasn't expecting any. I parked the bike and rushed inside, running past the bedroom on my way to the study. Something I saw made me stop and turn around. She was standing at the patio door looking out over the lake. I just love this view. She'd obviously heard me. I used to too, not so much now. Miles, what are you doing here? A better question is, what are you doing here when you should be on a sailboat on the lake? I know that look. I used to love looking at you. Who is he? She started to stammer her excuses as the door swung open and her sailing instructor burst into the room. Damn it. I got what you wanted and... His voice broke when he saw me, and then panic set in. Mr. Molson, it's not what it looks like. It looks like you two weren't at the lake doing what I paid you to do. It looks like it was more fun than learning. But maybe you were teaching her something new. Don't smoke, don't lie, just get the hell out. And it goes without saying that your services are no longer required, which I will detail to your boss. Go. I don't have transportation. Then go on foot. You have plenty of time to get out before I get to you, but if I make it, all you'll be able to do is crawl. Take your pick. He was a slender fellow about 5'9", with the deep tan of a man who spends a lot of time on the water, good cheekbones, and beautiful boyish eyes. I intended to shut them both up, maybe punch a dimple in his chin, and he noticed it. He was 2 jumps ahead of me as he popped out the door, and I stood there watching him run down the driveway. When I turned around, she was standing behind me. Honey, Just stop, Darla. It's just the way it is. You couldn't be happy, could you? You wanted it all and you almost got it. Now you'll get some, but it won't be what it could have been. You won't have to waitress anymore, but you might have to go back to work. I want you to think of me now and then, when your feet get sore or your next lover leaves, and realize what you've lost. She let out a strangled cry and reached for me. Don't touch me. I'm not sure how I'll react. Go sit on the couch. Now. Darla jumped at the volume of my voice and rushed over to the couch. Seizing the opportunity, I walked out the door, stopping to pull out the knife I'd carried with me since I was 12 and slash her 2 tires. Knowing it would take quite a while to change the tires, I was in no hurry to drive home. Driving a motorcycle in a state of rage is not a good combination, and I forced myself to remain calm. When I got home, I packed a small backpack, got back on the motorcycle, and rode for 6 hours before stopping in a small town in Virginia. I stayed at a small independent motel, paying cash. I had to show my credit card for security purposes, but if I hadn't needed it, there would have been no record of my stay there. The hosts recommended a small restaurant within walking distance, and the simple food was well cooked and seasoned, and overall very hearty. I wrote it all down in my writerly mind, knowing that I would use it to create a scene in a future novel. By the time I left, I was an old friend, and 2 different couples offered to drive me back to the motel. I thanked them, but told them I needed to walk to stretch after 6 hours on the motorcycle. I ended up staying another night, making a short trip to the local mall to change clothes and picking out jeans and a t-shirt. I got back to the motel, and the 60-year-old woman who ran it was already waiting for me. Miles Molson, I knew there was something familiar about you. Would you sign my book? She had 3 of them. 1 was for her, 2 were for her friends. Wait till the girls in my book club see this. A real live author staying at my motel. I wish they could meet you. The woman had been very kind in the short time I'd known her, and I grinned. When are you 2 meeting? Tonight. Why? How would you feel about having a writer speak at your club? It would be great to talk to real people for a change. I seriously thought for a moment she was going to faint. You'd do that for me? It's better than staring at walls and looking at boobs tonight. But I need one condition. She insisted on taking me to the local bookstore. I was amazed that independent bookstores still existed and bought every copy of my latest novel they had in stock. Before I left, I took pictures, including one in front of the store with my logo emblazoned on it. The only thing I asked was not to post the picture for at least 24 hours. I'd be long gone by then. All 12 ladies from the book club were absolutely thrilled, but it only lasted for 45 minutes. Then, with the directness of small town and rural dwellers, the questions, while not insulting, made one wonder. Why did this character go in that direction while the other chose not to? What made me eventually reconcile the lovers? Shouldn't she have been punished more for her indiscretion? And then it hit me. I didn't need to punish Darla. I just needed to cut her out of my life. Yes, she might end up with a few $1 million, but how long would she last? I already had 7 new romances, and none of them needed to be worked on before the divorce. Then she will have no rights to any of the profits I make. My money would hopefully keep coming in and multiplying, and hers would eventually come to naught. I finally thanked the ladies for the welcome, and after about 1 million pictures we were done. Marge insisted that I have breakfast with her and her family before leaving the next morning, and her husband asked me to autograph his action-adventure movie, saying how much he enjoyed it. I promised them copies of my new work as soon as it came out, and pointed the bike south. Next chapter. Just before I left, I turned on my phone, listened to the almost continuous beeping of messages and texts, and dialed my lawyer. He seemed glad to hear from me. When he ran out of breath, I asked him a few questions. I know it's not the end of the world, so I want you to find me a really good divorce attorney, and I need your opinion on how to protect any future profits from going into my soon-to-be ex's pockets. Tell me what I need to do, and help me do it. When you find an attorney, file her lawsuit as soon as possible. In our state, the reason for divorce doesn't matter, so just point out irreconcilable differences and ask her not to be difficult. If she resists, tell her I'm more than willing to let this drag on forever, but any costs she incurs will be covered at her expense from her portion of the settlement. This man had been an intellectual property attorney for 30 years and had dealt with this situation many times, so he called an old friend of his who had the reputation of being the biggest shark in the state, and she agreed to represent me. He also told me to stop working on anything I had, and if I couldn't, not to talk about it. At his insistence, I called the attorney and explained the situation. She asked me some very pointed questions about my fidelity and breathed a sigh of relief when she heard my answers. What is, and we can't deny it or not give her what she deserves. I'm very glad you don't have a problem with that. What I want to ask is, if you are being so generous with her, is there any chance of reconciliation? If so, you can save a lot of money if you stop now. I have no problem giving her what's owed to her. She supported me when a lot of people ridiculed or dismissed my writing as stupidity, and then laughed at the same people who tried to suck up when I was successful. She deserves some of that money, but not what I make going forward. How hard will it be? Not difficult at all, as long as you don't publish anything until at least 3 months after the divorce. I can wait 6 too if I have to. Then I'd have to turn something over to the publisher, or I'd be in breach of contract. Do you think she'll resist? I have no idea, but at the time I didn't think she'd cheat either. If she does or tries counseling, I'll become unavailable. I may have to do a little research that will result in me leaving the country for a while. That might work, but it may not work. A lot depends on the judge we get. Have you protected your assets? I hadn't even thought about it, but then again, we didn't keep much cash in the bank, maybe 25 or 30,000. I checked when I hung up the phone. There was $10 in the account. That's when it hit me that we had 5 credit cards, and I hastily canceled them all. I called the attorney back and she told me not to worry unless I needed them, and we would deduct them from the settlement. She had me contact the bank and my investment advisor, and he liquidated a couple things and put 50 grand into a new account with only my name on it. Then he froze everything until the divorce was resolved. Next chapter. The next day, I got a new credit card and used it while traveling. Before I continued traveling, I biked back to the yacht club and asked to see the manager. He appeared, smiling, and asked if my wife liked learning to sail. I have no idea. As far as I can tell, all her instructor does is teach her how to be a better whore. I just wanted to tell you to your face what your employee has been up to and let you know that further lessons will not be paid for by me. You should see to it that the check is paid if she does. I can sue. I won't get anything, but I'll be sure it will embarrass you personally and cost the club a bunch of legal fees. Or you can sack the bastard immediately and it'll all go away. The manager didn't blink an eye. I offer my deepest apologies. It is not our club's mission to break up marriages. He should be back from class in about 15 minutes. Would you like to witness his dismissal? Well, since you asked so politely. 20 minutes later, the asshole pulled the boat up to the dock and secured it to the slip. The woman he was instructing was in her early 40s and looked like a regular suburban housewife, but he was stroking her ass and whispering in her ear. She started to button her top just as the manager appeared. Good lesson, Mrs. Martin? Did Alvin teach you anything new today? Alvin. Did he? I suddenly mentally pictured him as a chipmunk and it made me grin. Mrs. Martin was very flustered and stammered when answering. The manager smiled and nodded. I'm afraid this will be your last lesson for a while, unless you find another instructor. The other 3 instructors are busy until the cold weather. Alvin will be leaving us soon. Alvin seemed surprised, and as soon as the woman was gone, the manager spoke to him. I had a very interesting conversation this morning, Alvin. Do you know the name Miles Molson? He turned pale. His wife is one of my students. Ah, yes, a student. Mr. Molson tells me you're teaching her all sorts of interesting things. I warned you about that last time the husband complained. You must leave, Alvin. Clean out your locker and leave. You are not allowed on the grounds. My father. He'll be in complete agreement when I discuss it with him at dinner tonight. Remember, he's one of the founders of this club and chairman of the board of directors. He'll be very upset if there are rumors of your adventures. I hope you know how disappointed he is in you. 5 years of college and you're not even close to a degree? I'm giving you some free advice. You might want to consider keeping your lips off his ass for the next 2 months, or you'll find out how cold the world can be, especially if you pay your own bills. Come on, pack your things and leave. He sighed, slumping his shoulders and turned around, looking straight into my smirking face. I should kick your ass. You can try it. Let's see how your training compares to Redneck Foo. The Commodore, as he was called by all who knew him, laughed. Alvin, kick your ass on your own time, preferably away from here. Go away. Screw you, old man. I'll kick your ass first. His eyes returned to me as I laughed. Can I watch you try? The Commodore is a retired Special Boat Service officer and a veteran of 2 wars. Plus, I know he holds advanced belts in 2 martial arts. Do you mind if I videotape this? It'll look great on Instagram. I can already see the title, Young Punk Kicks 70-year-old Man's Ass. You'll go viral in no time. He looked back and forth at our smirking faces. The Commodore spoke in a quiet but humor-filled voice. That's not entirely true, Mr. Molson. I'm actually 71 years old. I'll be sure to correct that when it is published. Alvin didn't see any good in the situation, so he stormed past us, muttering and uttering unspecific threats. The Commodore sighed and held out his hand. Square? Squared. You can ask my wife if she intends to pay for a dock for her yacht. I believe she should pay in 3 days. I will discuss it with her. I am truly sorry for your position, Mr. Molson. Thank you. So am I. We shook hands again and I left, wondering what kind of reception Darla would receive when she showed up for her next class. Alvin had probably already called her and told her everything. I'd like to hear that conversation. I spent the next 4 months in limbo. I made my way south, paying cash and staying out of sight. When I got to Florida, I hopped on a plane to Belize, rented a small bungalow, hooked up Wi-Fi, and worked. Once a month, I called my lawyer to get an update. The second month, we had a long conversation. She came to see me twice. Both times I had to turn her down, citing ethical standards. Then she made an appointment and brought her lawyer with her. She was very disappointed when I refused to give her your contact information. Any other instructions? No. Go ahead. When will she appear in court? In about a month and a half, maybe a little later? Are you coming? Do I have to? It would be better if you came, but I can cite out-of-country commitments and the judge might buy it. Or maybe he won't. We'll see. Let me know. Next chapter. To make sure my lawyer didn't turn out to be a liar, I asked my agent to book several talk shows in Europe, including the Graham Norton show. It was one of the highest-rated shows when I talked about my upbringing, and he was at a loss for words when I described snipe hunting to him. The actors sitting on the couch with me laughed so hard they needed tissues, and the French starlet snorted very ungraciously, which again pissed everyone off. I received several invitations to spend time on a yacht or at a country estate, but declined them as gracefully as I could, citing legal obligations. I was determined to wear the ring until the divorce was finalized and waved it like a shield when the Frenchwoman suggested spending a few days on the Riviera. It seemed to confuse her that marriage vows mattered. Over the next few weeks, I traveled to Germany, Sweden, and Italy, racking up frequent flyer miles. Movies came out on Amazon that were very well received. My publisher tried to push back the deadline, but I made my lawyer and agent stick by promising them I would come out on the agreed-upon date. I called my divorce attorney, and she gave me the latest news. You're in court. It's next Monday. You don't have to be there, but I suggest you show up. She's fighting the agreement, but when the judge sees it, I have no doubt he'll approve it. Well, he better approve it. I was giving her half of everything we had accumulated so far, which amounted to almost $3 million. I was giving her our little house and insisting on selling the lake house. It was a stumbling block because she really wanted it. It's never gonna happen. I will burn the house to the ground before I give her the place she turned into a love nest to betray me. She'll also get half the proceeds from the Netflix deal. My business lawyer told me that if I procrastinate too long on the romance movie deal, she might end up getting nothing. Without it, she'd still get about $5 million. She kept her car, our little house, and I kept the truck and motorcycle, and we walked away. How hard was that? Very. It seemed like it. I got into town on the day of the trial and didn't show up until the court date was announced. Darla's eyes widened when she saw me, and she tried to get up, but her lawyer pulled her back down. She looked well built, but seemed to have lost a little weight. She should be happy about that. She always said she wished she was 10 pounds lighter. The judge was an older woman with an uncompromising temperament, and she complimented me on being so candid about our financial situation. Most men, especially with your level of wealth, would have fought her tooth and nail, she said. Until I caught her sleeping with another, we were full partners in everything we did. She deserves what she gets, and I don't regret it. Your wife is very insistent on counseling. How do you feel about that? Ma'am, Your Honor, we come from very humble families. I was raised in a Baptist church and hold to the old school on matters of fidelity. So while I don't mind sharing our property, I don't see the need to continue our marriage. She has violated my trust in her, and she will never get it back. In my opinion, trust holds as high a place in the marriage commitment as love. No counseling in the world will convince me otherwise, so I think we're wasting our time. She looked at me for a minute and sighed. Okay. This marriage is hereby dissolved. Mr. Molson, Mrs. Molson, you are no longer husband and wife. Try to live a good life and don't end up in front of me again. Next case. Darla's attorney flew off his chair with indignation. That's it? No chance of reconciliation? Not if one of the partners doesn't want it. She got a very favorable deal. She's young, still attractive, gets a pretty hefty paycheck, so she won't be left destitute, so she shouldn't have a problem starting over. Maybe she'll learn from her mistakes. Or maybe she won't. I don't need to remind you that this is a guilt-free state. And if someone doesn't want to get married, they don't even have to give a reason. Let him lie there. And just like that, I was no longer married. She tried to change the financial agreement twice, once when my new book came out and once when the movie was completed, but my lawyers backed me up and it went nowhere. Her final share of our cost was a little over $6 million. I guess my fortune had accumulated over the course of our separation. Most people live their whole lives and don't accumulate that much. She should have been happy. And it took her about a year and a half and a little over $1 million to get back on an even keel. My guess is that somewhere around that point she woke up, had a moment of clarity, kicked out the person who shared her bed and got on with her life. Darla put the house up for sale and moved to a bigger city, buying an apartment and going to college. She did well in school, and it always bothered her that we couldn't afford college. I had no idea what her major was, and the only reason I knew anything at all was because her sister was still friends with her on Facebook. Next chapter. I found that I enjoyed my time on the bike, so every couple months I would go away for a week or so, point my bike in some direction, and just ride. I've always liked long hair, and now that I have some spare cash, I let it grow. I didn't really like the beard, so I stayed clean-shaven, always wore good clothes, and was almost never harassed by cops on my rides. One cop in South Carolina recorded me going 4 miles per hour over the speed limit. Apparently, the small town needed the revenue, and he kept adding something to the fine. I didn't complain, although he pressed me too, hoping for a chance to send me to jail. He was shaken to the core when he showed up in court and asked to see the surveillance tape. He sputtered and stuttered, but finally admitted it was off, saying he had turned it off when he went to the bathroom and forgot to turn it back on. He didn't realize that I had filmed the whole thing on my phone, which was hidden in the breast pocket of my jacket and out of sight. There was a big discussion about whether it could be admitted, but I just shrugged and asked my lawyer to let them know that if they refused, the tape would be posted on social media before I even left the parking lot. The judge watched the tape in chambers, came out, dismissed all charges except the speeding ticket, fined me $100 and sent me on my way. The cop and the DA were discussing something heatedly with the judge as I drove away. I got out of town as fast as I could. I got my ass kicked in a small bar in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, in a fight I didn't start or participate in. But when the whole bar started fighting, they must have figured I was with the other guys. When the cops sorted us out, they asked me what my connection was. I don't have any. I just stopped for a beer. The deputy grinned. handing my license back to me. Wrong place, wrong time, right? At least you can put it in the book for the future. She recognized the name, and before they left, we had to get our picture taken with both cops. The owner's wife wanted a picture too, as did some of the visitors. I ended up having a few more beers with all of them, after which Cop Hottie followed me back to the hotel and then came by after work. We spent most of the weekend in bed, only going out to eat. She was the first black woman in my life, and despite the wild stories I'd heard as a kid in the South, she felt, smelled, and tasted like any other woman I'd had the pleasure of sleeping with, which means they were really, really good. She follows me on Facebook and other social media, and I send her books from time to time. Wanda invited me to her wedding to the biggest, whitest, most country guy in the universe. They seemed very happy together. One of the reasons I loved spending time in bars and small diners was the stories I could hear. Many of them appeared in some modified version or another in my writings, and I would smirk when I received reports that they had seen almost exactly the same thing, or an event described in the book had actually happened to them. Perhaps they were the ones I was writing about. Over the next 3 years, I released another Western, a novel, and a fantasy about a post-apocalyptic world. They all sold well, but the fantasy was the most successful, which surprised me immensely. They were all sold to production companies. I was invited to a fantasy movie set and spent 2 days enthralled, learning the tricks of makeup artists and special effects specialists. I briefly met the stars, but I didn't spend time with them. I found that I enjoyed watching magic happen more than watching magicians perform tricks. The people making the westerns found out about it and invited me. I even did a movie as Outlaw #3 where I got hanged. It was creepy, but the setup was safe, and the noose wasn't attached to anything, just in case. I was told not to shave for 4 or 5 days, then I went to the makeup chair where they greased my hair, put dirt on my face, and painted my teeth. When they were done, I was definitely not fit to be a presenter. I asked them not to name me in the movie because it was just for fun, and they smiled, saying that most screenwriters wanted out in the open. I didn't do romance, although when I saw the bedroom scene at the premiere, I regretted not doing it. They almost didn't get an R rating. Next chapter. I traveled, I went on dates, I even had 2 fairly lengthy romances, but they came to naught. Darla graduated from college with a degree in interior design and sent me an invitation. I didn't attend, but I sent her a very nice graduation gift and referred a couple people to the firm she worked for. I was in my publisher's office discussing some contract details when I met Ellen. She was of average height. She could use to lose 15 pounds, but she was perfectly on her feet. Still very slender overall. Lush was the word that came to mind. She had a cute little mouth, a pixie nose, black hair, and very blue eyes. I kept wondering where I'd seen her, and then my agent remarked, "This is Ellen Montoya, host of one of the hottest cooking shows on television. She's here to negotiate the release of her 3rd cookbook. She doesn't sell like you do, but she makes very good money." I realized why she seemed familiar. I had one of her cookbooks. I'd caught her eye a couple times, so she must have known who I was. She often talked about the perils of cooking for one, because she was recently divorced and it was the topic of the last season of her show. Gaining courage, I approached her. "If you could eat anywhere in the world, where would you get your next meal from?" She seemed a little surprised, but then smiled. "That's one of the most original lines I've ever heard. My choice may surprise you. It's going to be Yami's Drive-In in my old hometown. I would kill for one of his Yami's burgers with everything you need, with lots of fries and onion rings on the side." She was shocked when I told her I knew of this establishment and had eaten there twice in my travels. This led to a discussion about road food. I told her about a Chinese restaurant in Boone, North Carolina that was in an old farmhouse, and all the rooms had been converted into small private dining rooms. Then I told her about a fat back plate I was once served at a small diner in Greer, South Carolina. She told me about the crab cakes at a seafood restaurant in Maryland and the barbecued lamb she once had in a small town in Tennessee. That led to a discussion of barbecue in general, from all the southern states and a few western states. Damn, now I'm hungry. I looked at my watch and grinned. When I signed my last contract, my publisher had made a big deal of giving me a Rolex. I accepted the gift gracefully, letting him have his moment, and a week later I met with him and returned the watch. He seemed shocked to the core. Don't think I don't appreciate it because I do. It's just that I can't in good conscience own such a valuable thing if all it does is tell me what time it is. You want to do something for me? Sell it and give it away to aspiring writers, Maybe high school kids who could use a little encouragement. Think of it as teaching your next bunch of suckers who will make you even richer. I think he liked the idea. He advertised the scholarship in the local paper and on social media, saying it was my suggestion. He even reached out to other writers for help and was surprised by the response. A camp was organized, and 4 writers, including myself, led workshops. They were mostly questions on how to write, and more importantly, what to write. The technical aspects are pretty simple, at least for some people. What I want you to realize is that there is a difference between writers and storytellers. Writers deal with serious stuff. Storytellers just want to entertain you with a good read. And the advice to write about what you know? That's bullshit. You're 15 and 16 years old, and while you may know more about real life than I do, that doesn't mean you know everything. I'll let you in on one of my secrets, and I'll confess that I stole it from another writer. Dick Francis was a professional jockey. For a while, he rode races for the Queen of England and was very successful. Then he was injured in a steeplechase and could no longer ride, so he took up journalism and wrote about what he knew, horses and racing. Then he started writing mysteries, and if you read any of his books, there will be some kind of horse theme in them. Something he knew, but it often branched off into something completely unrelated to him. And it was usually another profession. Pilot, transportation driver, wine merchant, all on the backside of horse racing. That's the way I do it. I take a central theme and then branch out. If it's about a doctor, I do the research and stay as far away from the technical aspects as possible, but insert bits and pieces that convince that he's really a doctor. Research cannot be overemphasized. It's the same with soldiers, accountants, rock stars. Tell their stories using their professions as background. In addition to writing workshops, we did other fun activities. They were old enough to enjoy canoeing, horseback riding, hiking, and other outdoor activities. I grinned as I looked at them, knowing they would be recording their experiences for future use. My publisher gave me another watch that only cost $2,000, but I still felt it was too much. My expensive watch showed that it was 11 in the morning. You know, if we leave now, we can avoid the rush. I know a little burger joint that will impress you to your heart's content. It's not Yami's, but it's damn close. 10 minutes later, we were in my truck. 15 minutes after that, we pulled into a real drive-in with waitresses on ice skates. The grill they used was made in 1947, and it's never been washed with soap. The seasoning is embedded so deep, it will never come out. The milkshake machines were made in 1960 to 65 and completely renovated. They have 12 flavors of shakes, all made with ice cream whipped on site. Their only specialty is French fries. They mix different kinds, so an order might have seasoned potatoes, regular potatoes, pinwheel potatoes, and all mixed with an onion ring or two. Ellen's eyes shone with delight, and she applauded as the waitress brought our orders, rolled up to us, and did a 360, stopping right at our window. I gave her 100 to share with the other two, and they showed off in all their glory, whizzing past each other with millimeter to spare, and finally jumping over the picnic table in tandem. We managed to eat all of the third-pound hamburgers, but most of the fries were left on the tray. Ellen still managed to fish out the onion rings and throw them away. The cocktails we got almost finished us off, and we were on the verge of a food coma. Ellen surprised me by getting out of the car and following the girl into the building, turning around to wave at me. She spent 15 minutes talking to the owner and grill master. He told her that his cousin had a similar diner in Louisiana, and he always admired it when he visited. So when he had the money, he opened his own. I had to take a picture of the whole crew with Ellen in front of the building. The owner took the picture and hung it above the door. Then one of the waitresses recognized me, and Helene grinned and started fawning over me. Before we left, we both had to sign our ticket books and a pile of menus. She groaned as we pulled into the parking garage. I'm going to have to spend the rest of the day at the gym, or this food will go straight to my ass. Well, lucky you with the food then. I'm going to go take a nap. She looked up and saw me smirking, so she relaxed. I held the door open as we walked back into the office. It was nice to meet you, Ellen. I have one of your cookbooks and I watch your show from time to time. It inspired me to start a small garden, and I have a section on herbs. I took your advice and planted them in boxes and pots, but even then, the oregano seems to try to come out every time I'm away. I've read your books, most of them, and watched a couple of movies. High Noon at the End of the Universe is one of my favorite movies of all time. It was a lot of fun writing it. Space westerns seem to do well. We talked for a few minutes before she had to leave for the office. 3 weeks later, I was watching her show, and she was sharing photos of the diner I took her to. telling the audience what a good time she had and how delicious the burgers there were. There were a couple shots of us together, and she grinned as she looked at the screen. In case you're wondering, my date was Miles Molson. We work for the same publishing company and met there. He took me to Mel's Drive-In when I told him how much I missed the hamburgers I was served at a place like this in my hometown. He's a lot of fun to be with. I wonder why he hasn't called me yet. Miles, if you're watching, I'm still single. Hint, hint. She laughed. After getting a phone number from my publisher, I called and left a message. She must have been on set because she called back less than 2 hours later. I assume you watched the show last night. Is there anything you'd like to ask me? Direct and to the point, I see. Ellen, would you like to? Yes, I would. I'll send you my address. Be there at 7 and put on a suit. We're going to one of my favorite places. I'm sure you'll love it. We talked some more until she had to go back in front of the cameras, and a few more times before we left. I put on one of my suits I had purchased back in England and got behind the wheel of my Cadillac. We blended into the crowd at a 5-star restaurant. I recognized a few of the regulars, high-ranking politicians, stage and screen actors, and a few sports figures. Everyone seemed to know who was who and by unspoken agreement left each other alone except for the occasional friendly greeting. Some of the things she insisted I try I didn't like at all, but much was to my liking. We ate as little as possible, but it was a 5-course dinner, not counting dessert. When we left the restaurant, the confidentiality agreement flew out the window. There were several paparazzi hanging around taking pictures of everyone going in and out. Don't mind them, she said, heading toward our car. When she looked back, she saw that I was gone and I was talking to them. They were very surprised, and when Ellen returned, we even took a few pictures together. As we were leaving, she was not happy with me. Why did you do that? Research for one of my next books. I've always wanted to write a murder mystery, and these guys will probably have a story to tell. Besides, we'll be in all the papers tomorrow. What was it that actor from the past said? Any publicity is good publicity? Besides, we're just a B-list at best, and as soon as a big name comes along, we'll be on a roll. I didn't know it at the time, but I had offended her. She considered herself an A-lister of the highest order. Next chapter. People were used to seeing us at events, and she often mentioned me on her show. One day she giggled as she prepared a dish. Miles hates this. Probably not plebeian enough. Plebeian? Well, maybe. I quickly realized we were from different worlds. She brought me home to Texas for her parents' 30th wedding anniversary. It looked like an English homestead had been abandoned right in the middle of a cattle ranch. Seriously, the grounds had to be fenced off so the longhorns wouldn't eat up the landscaping. Her father was big, bossy, and incredibly overbearing. He pulled me into his library, and after a third brandy and a second cigar, I was kind of at a loss for words. Let me be clear. If we ever have a serious relationship and get married, I will marry her, not my family and especially not you. It's in your best interest to leave us alone. He blushed 5 shades of red and was still trying to find the words when I walked out. Ellen found me by the fountain in one of the exquisite gardens on the property. What did you say to Daddy? I told him to mind his own damn business. I saw her jump slightly in the moonlight, and then she started giggling. And what did he say? I don't know. I didn't wait for him to regain the power of speech. I think the shock that someone didn't care about his opinion made him speechless. Now he'll have a grudge against you. And that should worry me, why? Well, if we stay together, it's going to be incredibly awkward at family gatherings. No, it won't. If he acts calm and polite, I'll act the same way. If, however, he gets on his pompous horse, I will try to knock him out of the saddle. She was silent for a moment. Do you even know who my father is? Not really. We've never talked about our parents. He's Emilio Montoya. He owns Montoya Avionics, among other things. He designed the equipment that's in every airplane that flies in the air. Daddy is thinking of teaming up with another tech giant to develop a rocket ship for space tourism. He has about 3 years to become a trillionaire. Good for him. Wait, I thought your husband was Montoya. She giggled again. No, Dad made me promise I'd never change my last name and that all my children would carry it. All the men I've ever met, unless they were low-level gold diggers, would never give up their rights to the name. Does he really think he can get away with it? He's Emilio Montoya. Of course he can. She didn't know it then, but it was the beginning of the end for us. I told her unequivocally that all the children I would bear would carry my last name. There was no negotiating. There wasn't a single reason in the world for me to change my mind. Daddy said he'd make sure I didn't get a dime of his money if I didn't follow his wishes. Then you better marry someone you can control, because that won't go over well with most men. Besides, if you value money more than any potential partner, your relationship is doomed from the start. There's probably a pretty strict prenup attached to all this, isn't there? She refused to answer and walked away. I was about to go in when I felt someone's presence. It was her mother, a true Southern belle in every sense of the word. Ellen told me what you said to my husband. I just wanted to thank you. It's been a while since he's been confronted by someone whose plans didn't include kissing his ass. Maybe this will help him realize what he needs. I haven't done anything that anyone else would have done. That's not necessarily true. Our wealth seems to scare most people, especially men romantically involved with our daughter. We talked for about an hour. She urged me to be patient with Ellen, that being away from her father's influence seemed to be good for her. I told her that she had been talking about children, and from the look on her face, it was news to her. She sighed. He wasn't like this when we got married. Success, the huge success he's had, has turned his head and given him an exorbitant sense of self-importance. How do you put up with him? Her teeth gleamed in the moonlight. When we started out, we had nothing, so there was no need for a prenup. When he became more successful, he had the nerve to present me with a postnuptial agreement. I will never forget the look in his eyes when I tore it up in front of him and his lawyer. Now he treats me like gold, knowing that I am the goose that can lay the golden egg. If we split up and I get 50% of his share of the company, anyone I team up with can take over and force him out of office. I think it keeps him up at night sometimes. Looking at her, I wondered if I could live like that, but thankfully it wasn't my life. She led me into an empty bedroom and I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Helena had nothing to say to me, and her father wouldn't have dinner with us. Her mom was in a good mood and teased her a little, making me smile. The ride back to the airport was a little chilly. A week later, we kissed and made up, but that conversation stayed in my mind the whole time. We each had separate homes, but for all intents and purposes, we lived together. She visited her family once a month, and I seemed to always be immersed in research, so I missed most of them. 8 months later, Ellen started insistently hinting at a ring. I decided to be blunt. I have deep feelings for you, Ellen. I could love you very easily, but let me ask you something. Will you marry me even if I insist that all of our children carry my last name? And I would insist that you carry it too. I'm a man who needs total commitment, and I will never ask for a prenup. Look me in the eye and tell me you can do it, and I'll be buying the ring before the week is out. She left and never came back. I spoke to her twice after that, and both times she treated me calmly. I wrote it off as a lesson learned and let it go, but she couldn't. She announced on her show that we are no longer a couple because I have no vision and am a very shallow person. She then started writing in gossip magazines and shows like TMZ that I was also lacking in the bedroom. I didn't respond to anything until she showed up at the Emmys drunk off her ass with a country singer barely out of his teens and told everyone she was glad she found a real man who, unlike me, knows how to use his equipment. I got my revenge in the only way available to a writer. I wrote her and her father into my next novel, and both characters turned out to be shallow, petty people to be avoided, if at all possible. I also hinted that their relationship might not be as traditional as commonly thought. It sold very, very well. When one reviewer asked me about it, I admitted that they had inspired my characters by giving the old adage about writing what you know. This prompted threatening letters from numerous lawyers, but I'd been in this game long enough to know how close I could get to the border, and I had a pretty spiffy set of lawyers. I also had a secret weapon. 2 paparazzi I had befriended during my research had become, if not friends, then close acquaintances. One of them even warned me about Ellen before I got in too deep. You need to be careful with her, kid. Her daddy's going to put down anyone who says a bad word about her. There have been several incidents over the past few years, and some interesting photos that have been destroyed or redeemed. When the Grammy Awards were going on, he was one of the photographers and followed them to the party, sneaking into the building across the street and shooting everything from the 3rd floor. He called me first, offering me the photos. I gave him more than he asked for and sent one to her and her father. The picture was of her with a man. Attached to the photo was a note. It's over, we've broken up, and I will not tolerate any more disparaging comments or innuendos from either of you. The first one, however slight, and this picture will appear on the internet. Never speak my name in public again. Emilio had the good sense not to contact me, and he sent a team of lawyers, offering stupidly high sums for the rights to what I had. I sent them another picture of her sitting on a bench with a man on her lap with a clear message. No, leave me alone and this will never see the light of day. 18 months later, I saw the cover of the Wall Street Journal featuring Emilio and his wife in different photos. She had filed for divorce, citing infidelity. Apparently, she had been planning this for a long time because before the divorce, she had managed to accumulate enough stock on her own to become the majority shareholder after she got half of his shares. He would work for her if she let him stay. I smiled all day. Over the next 6 years, Ellen married and divorced 3 times, but they had no children, so there was no dispute over naming rights. Her mother married a man richer than herself 3 years after the divorce. I saw her and her new husband in Monaco when I went there to shoot my 8th movie. We had a nice dinner, and she told me that she hoped I was the right man for her daughter. I told her I wished I had come on the scene 30 years earlier because she would be my wife now. She burst out laughing, and her new husband struggled not to laugh. She turned to him and said that if I had been, he would have been just a passing acquaintance. They invited me to go sailing on their yacht for a few days, and I had to decline, but promised that next time I would definitely go with them if I had enough time. They made me promise, so I think they were sincere. Ellen's show was canceled, despite Daddy's money. She wrote a few more cookbooks and started a YouTube channel, but she didn't have many subscribers and drifted quietly into obscurity. Myra told me that she had moved back in with her father after she left, and I could tell by the look on her face that it bothered her. I was under the impression that there was nothing inappropriate between them, just an extreme case of papa worship. But who would have thought it? I didn't want to know that, of course. As I went to bed, I thought about how my life was shaping up. I had just spent the afternoon and evening socializing with the richest people in the world, and they seemed to have accepted me as one of their own. An unprecedented leap for a redneck who never went to college. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I wasn't intimidated or shocked by who they were. It didn't matter if the woman was wearing a $50,000 designer dress or a $15 dress from Walmart. Underneath, they were the same creatures. The same was true for men. A tailored tuxedo and a pocket full of money made no difference between you and a guy in jeans and a t-shirt. They each had their own dreams, triumphs, and miserable failures, just on a different scale. I got as many story ideas from them as I did from the people in the little bars, coffee shops, and diners I frequented, but with very few differences. My latest idea was a romance, a half-Cinderella tale, about a woman rich beyond any man's fantasies, drawn from my ability to walk in both worlds. Bidding for the screen rights was already well underway, and the book had only been out for 3 weeks. The premiere was over, commitments had been made, and I was headed home. Home now meant a 4-bedroom house on the same lake as my old one. Darla was furious when I insisted on selling it, and we didn't get it. But my lawyer had a nice chat with her lawyer and let him know how expensive and protracted the divorce would be if she didn't relent. It took 3 months to get her to agree. It didn't matter. She now had her own money and could buy whatever she wanted, so she bought a house 5 houses down from our old one. When I bought mine, I made sure it was as far away as possible, but still shared a common shoreline. She had finally learned to sail, and I would see her on the lake from time to time. I bought a pontoon and a speedboat, using them depending on how many I had. Ellen and I were walking one day when I saw her boat and pointed it out to her. She grinned and beckoned me to come closer, lowering the top. I called out to her and she looked down and smiled until she saw Ellen sunbathing on the bow. She tilted so fast she almost capsized and crashed into us, and with a scream she sailed away. I wasn't as impressed with the stunt as Ellen was, and she talked about it until I told her to stop. And there was a new woman in my life and she demanded a lot of attention. Brenda, so named because she was ropey, was an American bully, a breed similar to a pit bull on steroids. They were bred by my editor's wife, and she couldn't wait to show off her new litter. They were about 7 weeks old, and when I petted them, Brenda refused to share and captured my attention. I tried to buy her, and Joan laughed. See that new house? You helped pay for it by using Tim and steering new writers in his direction. You pay for her papers and the rest of the pictures, and we'll consider ourselves even. Joan also taught Brenda to obey simple commands and to behave. She offered guard training, but I was uncomfortable and declined. Okay, but realize this. These dogs are very kind, but they are territorial, and if they or someone they consider part of their pack is threatened, they may react badly. Brenda loved 2 things besides me, I hoped: horseback riding and babies. She let the little ones crawl all over her, pulling her fur and ears and vibing happily the whole time. I was at my parents' house, along with my sister, brothers, their families, friends, and about 10 babies, ranging from 10 to 18 months old. Brenda was over the moon as they chased each other around the yard and lay in the grass. Their neighbor had a pit bull he kept on a chain, and he often teased Brenda, saying she was a blow-up doll that looked like a real dog. I only grinned. Maybe in your mind. But consider this. My dog has a big fenced backyard where she can play, she sleeps in my house and goes everywhere I go if I let her. And you keep yours on a chain and maybe pet her once or twice a day. I bet if he had a choice, he'd be in my house in a second. Brenda could use a boyfriend, but then again, she'd probably make him her bitch. He took a deep breath to begin his tirade, thought for a moment, and walked away. He had already developed a beer belly while I was still slim and trim. He knew instinctively that any confrontation would not end well for him. The day went well until Mom started her obligatory, "Why don't you get married and give me grandchildren" speech. Really? You have 7 grandchildren running around the yard and you're complaining? I think you've exceeded your quota. You're missing the point. I'll give you an analogy. You know Brett is obsessed with guns, and I once told him he had too many guns. He pouted and said, "You can never have too many guns." Guns were important to him. Now I can never have too many grandchildren. I'll seriously consider it, but I still need to meet someone I care enough about to marry. That may take some time. My track record isn't the best. She grinned sadly. Mom really liked Darla. Then she perked up. I can wait, but you have to step up. It took a promise to make her happy, and I grinned as I drove home, listening to Brenda pant. She'd had a rough day. Fiddling with a bunch of kids can take a lot out of you. It wasn't that I didn't date. I met some interesting women along the way. They came from all sorts of backgrounds and social classes. A waitress I met at a small Texas diner I dated for 3 months before she broke up with me, saying I was too much for her. It got me thinking. She had a college degree and I didn't. But despite that, I was worth more than she'd probably make in a lifetime. She worked as a waitress just to have something to do. Her parents were rich, and she had no money problems. It all seemed strange to me, and I was somewhat relieved when she gave her little speech. Then I was dating a singer from Detroit who had dropped out of school in 9th grade, but had made her way to the top of the music charts through sheer will and extraordinary talent. I thought we were getting close when she ended the relationship by saying that, according to demographics, I was too white for her, and it was hurting her sales. I think that told me where her priorities lie. Next chapter. Sometimes I thought I'd never be a match for anyone again because I'd developed a habit of completely isolating myself when I started writing, disappearing into my office for weeks on end. On the other hand, if I had a family, I might have changed my priorities. I often feared I'd run out of ideas, and then a news article or an overheard conversation at a diner or bar would set me off again. I ran into Darla at a yacht club where they were celebrating the Commodore's retirement. He was 75, and the board of directors would have been more than happy to let him die in office, but he wanted to go to the islands, which was very unspecific, so he had to be let go. I became, if not a friend, a warm acquaintance. When I had a nautical question for one of my novels, he was the first person I thought of, and I invited him to dinner to reflect. When I needed material for a novel about a retired military man, his years of service gave me everything I needed. For that, I paid him a consulting fee and acknowledged his contribution in the foreword. He was a great lover of history, especially maritime history, and often spoke of his fascination with the failed attempt to find the fabled Northwest Passage that led to the death of Admiral Franklin and the crews of both his ships. Oddly enough, it seemed that more people were lead poisoned than the elements, as a result of the canned food they were carrying being sealed with lead. As a retirement present, I received a custom-made replica of HMS Terror, the Admiral's flagship. It was built into a large bottle, and you could tell he was touched when he opened it. As we chatted, I came face to face with my ex. She looked a little scared, but when I didn't try to decapitate her on the spot, she relaxed. It was actually a pretty polite conversation, and we talked about safe topics. She showed me her wedding ring. He's a good man, Miles, quite successful, and I know without a doubt that he loves me. She was waiting for me to say something, so I congratulated her. Then I grinned. Already got him to sign a prenup? She laughed. He's a lawyer in his father's firm, so the prenup is a given, more to protect him than me. I met him when I needed to get rid of Boy Toy. I remembered reading about it in the local paper. She'd been with the guy for 2 years when she caught him with someone else and kicked him out. He tried to beg for forgiveness, but when she refused, a lawsuit ensued. He demanded alimony from her, claiming she should maintain the lifestyle he was used to. The whole thing was hilarious. His lawyer told him he didn't stand a chance, but he persisted. And when they went before the judge in the old Law and Order style, he was defeated. After hearing the evidence, the judge didn't even retire to the chambers to deliberate. He banged his gavel with vigor. The suit is dismissed for lack of legal standing, among other things. Sir, it requires you to have lived with someone for 7 years as husband and wife, and you lived with her for 26 months. You didn't work the entire time you were together, and she supported you, so I believe all her debts to you are paid in full. You are young, healthy, have a university degree, and with the current labor market situation, you should have no problem finding a job. The case is closed. Her attorney stopped the judge. Your Honor, my client would like her property returned to her. This man is driving a car she paid for, and it is registered in her name. Her ex became furious. She gave me that car. It's mine. The judge looked at Darla. The woman grinned, taking great pleasure in what was happening. Your Honor, I bought the car because he needed transportation. I paid for it, it's in my name, and I never once said it was his. But he can have it, if it means that much to him. He just has to put her in his name and make the last 17 payments. Ordered. I understand it's a convertible Camaro, and it cost over $70,000, so you're getting a hell of a bargain. Get all the paperwork done in no more than 2 weeks, and if you can't find financing, he'll get back to her immediately. Understood? His lawyer spoke before he could mumble. Understood, Your Honor. The lawyer told him he'd help and paid off the loan, and once it was transferred into his name, the lawyer took it away for non-payment of the bill. I smirked when Darla got the idea. Don't you dare put that in the book. It's already half written. You'll be pleased to know that your heroine is fragrant as a rose, has met Prince Charming, and lives happily ever after. Life seems to mirror fiction. She was silent for a moment. I let it master me, you know. All those years I was living well, and then I had money, and it warped my reality. What was it your uncle used to say when all those people were getting a tax deduction? That they all became rich rednecks? Well, that was me. I just took it to the extreme. If it means anything, I'll regret it until the day I die. But I know you'll never forgive me, so I have to move on. If anything, I'm really sorry. Before I could respond, her new man approached. I noticed the suit, the perfect haircut and gleaming teeth, the hint of the God complex so common to doctors and lawyers in his eyes, and wondered if she was making a mistake. Then he looked at her and clucked his tongue as she pulled him in for a kiss. And I knew she was going to be okay. We talked for a few minutes, and I got the feeling that I had made him nervous, so I moved on. I shook the Commodore's hand and told him not to forget me, because when I ran into a problem on which I needed expert advice, he would be the first person I would call, even after he moved back to Scotland. He really appreciated the gift and told me what a retirement present he had given himself. I am joining a team that is going to repeat Admiral Franklin's route, and with global warming affecting the Arctic so much, we may well go through the legendary passage. I wished him luck and told him to keep a videotape and post it for all to see. He liked the idea. Just as I was about to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder. Let me introduce you to my granddaughter. She has flown in to help me complete my life here, something I didn't even realize I needed so badly. Miles Molson, I would like to introduce you to Fiona Wallace, my second oldest granddaughter. If I had expected to see a fiery-haired Scottish girl with green eyes and a host of freckles, I would have been sorely disappointed. Fiona had naturally blonde hair, blue eyes, and was just over 6 feet tall. She looked like a Scandinavian princess, perhaps Freya from Viking mythology. As she shook my hand, amusement splashed in her eyes. Not what you expected? I wasn't expecting anything, but if I had, it wouldn't have been you. I have a feeling there may be Viking ancestry in your family tree. There are, but it's not ancient. My father is a Swede, and I certainly got his looks. Then your father must be a very handsome man. As soon as that came out of my mouth, I realized what I'd said. She burst into laughter, and the Commodore struggled to hide a smile. That's not how I would describe him, son. She got his physical traits, but the beauty came from her mother. Well, then they must be a very handsome couple. I'd like to meet them sometime. We talked for a few more minutes before someone led the Commodore out for another round of farewell toasts. I was fascinated by this woman, but she lived on another continent, so I chalked it up to a pleasant experience. She was definitely going to appear in some book. After a few minutes, I walked out. It's been a pleasure, but I have to go. I'm off to Chile tomorrow to do some research. Tell your grandfather I'll call him when he's settled in. If you're looking for your wife, She's over there. I looked in the direction she pointed and saw Darla looking at us, and she didn't look pleased. That's not my wife. At least not anymore. We've been divorced for over 4 years now. Does she know that? See that handsome man walking toward her? They're getting married in 4 months. She shrugged. I think maybe a year from now. I know his type, and they love themselves much more than they love anyone else, and it makes them feel entitled. You're very perceptive. He's a lawyer. Ah. The way she pronounced that single syllable spoke volumes. Well, let's hope for the best. That's very generous, considering who you're talking about. Do you still carry a bit of the flame inside you? No. I mean, sometimes I remember what we had and I get sad, but not sad enough to go back to her. In case you're wondering, she's the one who cheated on me. I'm a little hard on some things, and fidelity is at the top of that list. You're either faithful or you're not. And if you're not faithful, then as far as I'm concerned, we're not faithful. It's as simple as that. She sighed. It's interesting to see someone who looks at life in such a black and white framework. Have there been no shades of gray in your life? Not that I recall, no. Well, as enlightening as this conversation has been, I should get going. There's an early flight tomorrow. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Give the Commodore my regards. As the English put it, the Commodore was at ease. Good thing Fiona was a large woman. I had a feeling she'd have to use some of those muscles for the rest of the night. She gave me a surprised hug and I found her business card as I took off my jacket. Here we go. Next chapter. I spent a couple of very relaxing and interesting weeks in South America. I studied coastal privateering, and it had a rich history going back to the 1500s. I hired a local professor to guide me, and we visited places I'm sure tourists have never seen. Most of the people were open and friendly, but we visited one remote village that was only accessible by foot or mules, and to say they were suspicious of strangers would be an understatement. On the second day, they warmed up a bit, especially after I got drunk on beer of their variety and sang songs to them as we danced in a circle. I played my harmonica for them, and the headman liked it so much that I gave it to him as a parting gift. The professor was amazed when they showed us some of their treasures. Coins from Portugal, Spain, and Britain, mostly gold. We got to talking on the way back down the mountain, and he swore me to secrecy. I agreed, knowing what a horde of treasure hunters such news would bring. I never told him about the Spanish doubloon in my pocket, a gift from the family I was staying with. I had become convinced that in remote areas candy was worth more than money, especially when given to children. I handed the package to my wife, telling her to distribute them wisely. They were smiling like crazy, and as we climbed up the steep trail, I wondered if they would share with us. I wrote to the Commodore, but Fiona replied that he was off to find the Northwest Passage and wouldn't be back until a few months later. I hope he enjoyed his adventure and will be sure to contact him when he returns. He was a walking encyclopedia. What an outdated term, I thought, of British maritime lore going back to the Middle Ages. I introduced him to the film crew, and they ended up using him as a historical consultant, even mentioning him in the credits. Word spread, and he often gave advice that movie companies were willing to pay for. It was a very lucrative part-time job. I wondered what he would think when he found out that the BBC Netflix documentary about his expedition was financed by me through my shiny new production company. Both my agent and my lawyer pushed me to set it up, saying it would give me even more control over my work and bigger royalties for them. I rested for a week and then locked myself in my office and started working. Every now and then I had to stop to take notes and give them to the Commodore for review. It wasn't necessary, but when I was writing about a certain period of time, I wanted to be as accurate as possible. 2 months later, Fiona called. Grandpa's back, but the adventure got him down. I heard her pacing until she decided she couldn't be overheard. He doesn't look well, Miles. I guess he shouldn't have gone, but it was his life's dream and he was able to fulfill it. Not too many people on the planet can say that. The first thing I made him do when he got home was see a doctor. He's on bed rest right now, going crazy, and if you can keep him busy with something, it might help. I asked her to connect him with a doctor, and after a few pleasantries and a brief description of his journey, I asked him to check my research and offer ideas to make the work more accurate. He brightened noticeably and took my promise to send him my notes, saying he would get back to me as soon as possible. Take your time, Commodore. I have a feeling this will be my best work in a while, and I want it to be as close to perfect as possible. He laughed, knowing firsthand how meticulous I can be at times, and we bowed out. I stared at my phone for a second, determined to visit him as soon as possible. I grinned, thinking about how meticulous I was. I've been known to get obsessive from time to time. I had a writer friend who I visited whenever I found myself in her town, most often having dinner with her family, though we did get out every now and then. Her husband was large, moved with the grace of a cat, and his eyes were always wandering. One evening, Constance saw me watching him and grinned. I know it's killing you, but don't ask. He won't tell you anything anyway. Let's just say he works for the government and leave it at that. And don't you dare try to mine him? Where do you think I get a lot of my plots from? I didn't realize how witty he was until we were sitting around after dinner, sipping a glass of wine, when he looked at me and grinned. Mozart? What? You're like Mozart. Everyone was amazed at how he could write a piece of music without revision, although he actually wrote and rewrote it in his head so many times that when it was written down it was almost perfect. Connie told me how you once wrote an entire novel while on a book signing tour with her and how easy it seemed to you. You know she struggles with everything she writes and double-checks everything, and you just let it all out and make small edits. Tell me, how long was your last book written in your head before you touched the keyboard? Grinning, I told him at least 9 months. That's not always the case. Sometimes when I sit down at the table, I have no idea what the character is going to say next, and it leads me down all sorts of rabbit holes. The end product sometimes turns out to be nothing like I envisioned. How many do you have in your head right now? 5. 2 are almost ready to go to print, so to speak. Another one will take no more than 2 months. Connie rolled her eyes. I hate you. No, you don't hate me. You just hate my method. Your method works well for you. You have the most elaborate plot lines I've ever seen. Your vision of where the book should go usually coincides, and yet you manage to surprise the reader. We'd often thought about writing together, but I think we both knew our styles would never match. But it was still interesting to talk, and we'd occasionally pitch ideas to each other. They usually spent a week with me every summer. She had a little breakdown when Grant and I hit her laptop after the first day, but then she relaxed and had a great time. Her boys were 9 and 11 years old, and we spent a lot of time at the lake. It made me miss my kids, but I came to the conclusion that a happy life with kids and a fence was not in my future. A month later, I found myself on the coast of Scotland, a place with rolling hills and small coves. Smuggling had been big business in these parts for 1,000 years, and still occasionally happens. Unfortunately, now the smuggling was mostly drugs. The Commodore had a small estate that had been in his family for generations. The death of his wife had hit him hard, and he had moved to America so as not to be reminded of her everywhere. Fiona and her husband used it while he lived in the States, and just before he returned home, they separated for unspecified reasons, leaving her with their son while he moved to Portugal. Ian was 12 years old, a fiery-haired lump of energy who never seemed to settle down. He would take me on walks along the ridges overlooking the ocean in between sessions with his grandfather, and for his age, he knew a lot of the history of the area. In fact, he gave me the basis for my next novel. Over there, he said, pointing down at a small cove. That's where the Vikings landed in 940. They sacked the local village and took most of the women away. 3 years later, a flotilla was sent against them in retaliation, and they brought the women back, as well as many Viking girls. I think they decided it was a kind of revenge. That led to raids and small wars. And now most of the locals have at least a little bit of Viking DNA in them, and red hair is common in parts of Scandinavia. For a 12-year-old, Ian was quite bright, and Fiona encouraged him every step of the way. One evening, we sat in their patio, using the new fireplace the Commodore had installed, and just talked. I complimented her son. She glowed. Yeah, he's a great guy, and I think he's sharp as a tack. He likes you a lot. I like him too. Sometimes when we talk, I almost forget he's a kid. If he had been born 2 centuries ago, he would have been a corsair. I suspect the Commodore had a lot to do with that. The Commodore would have made an excellent privateer. I don't doubt it. His military career gave him plenty of chances to pretend to be one, I'm sure. He doesn't usually talk about it much, but sometimes if he's relaxed enough and has had a few drinks, he tells stories that make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I knew. Many times when I counseled with him, it was just a chance to have a drink and hang out with him. I'm sure he told me stories no one else had ever heard, but also sternly warned me not to use any of them until after he passed away. Meh. Shifting the conversation, she told me a little about her ex. Gustav hated the sea, which is surprising for a Norwegian who grew up on the coast. I'm sure he had Viking blood running through his veins. Are you a sailor? I sail when I can. We have a small boat, and if it were up to my son, we'd live on it. There's nothing like being out on the open ocean, living subject to the wind and the currents. I'm afraid I wouldn't make a good sailor. I get a little queasy at the sight of land. My lineage gravitates more toward the mountains and prairies. She commented on my ex, and I ventured to ask about her marriage. She sighed. I know it sounds corny, but we just drifted apart. He gradually became less and less interested in his family and became obsessed with his career. Eventually, he practically lived in his office when he wasn't sharing his not-so-secret apartment with his companion of the month. Eventually, I got fed up with the farce and confronted him. When I offered a way out of the situation, he almost pathetically rushed to agree. I received a lump sum that will provide me with a penniless existence for the rest of my life, and Ian is assured of an education up to graduate school. For a moment, she stared lost in the fire. Then continued. I know this sounds civilized and unemotional, but I was hurt. I never let anyone see it, but there were many nights when I cried myself to sleep. Not so much because of him, but because of what we lost. How did Ian take it? I don't think it hurt him as much as it did me. His father had always been a bit aloof and hardly spent any time with him, so when he left, it was hardly felt. I think that was even a good thing. I took a chance and leaned toward her, wrapping my arms around her. To my surprise, she hugged me so tightly that we almost fell off our chairs. Come on, she said, getting up and leading me to the wicker couch. She snuggled against me, murmuring into my chest. There, isn't that better? Not just better, but better. It's impressive. She giggled, still not letting go of me. After about 20 minutes, she pulled away and stood up. Thanks, Miles. It's been a long time since I've been in the arms of a man I could trust. No, don't thank me. It's been a very long time since I've felt this happy hugging a woman. Maybe we should snuggle up to each other tomorrow to make sure this isn't an isolated incident. Her laugh was deep and rich. I'll take that under advisement. Now off to bed, separately. I'll see you in the morning. She turned to leave, then turned around and plopped into my lap, kissing me with passion and abandon. That lasted probably 2 minutes or less before she jumped up and ran off into the house, giggling in the air. The next morning, she hardly spoke to me, and I spent 5 hours with the Commodore, recording the exploits of his long and varied career in Her Majesty's service. At last, we were interrupted when he said he was tired, and I went on deck, pondering what he had told me. Looking up, I saw Ian smirking at me. Come with me. Mom has something she wants to show you. He led me around the house to meet Fiona. She was wearing black leggings, sturdy hiking boots, and a thick, cable-knit sweater that went down below what must have been a prominent belly. She smiled, took my hand, and, leading Ian in front of her, led me through the marshes to the cliffs above the sea. She stopped and looked into my eyes. I want to show you something. Before I do, you must promise everyone you care about never to write or talk about it. It is a secret that was born here and must stay here. It is sacred to the locals, and some of them will be very upset if I let an outsider see it. Promise me, Miles. I thought for a moment. I promise. I promise for my affection for you and your son, for my deep respect for your grandfather, and most importantly, for my personal honor. She looked at me intently and only then nodded. Then she smiled. Ian, get the rope ready. I'd been wondering what was in his backpack, and now I knew. He attached the rope to a weathered tree and slung it over the edge. He grinned at me. Relax, there's a trail here, but it's very steep and you can't afford to stumble. Just hold on to the rope as we go down and you'll be fine. Fiona went first, and it really wasn't easy. I followed her as best I could with Ian following behind. We descended about 80 feet and stopped at a ledge rising above the sea by maybe 10 feet. It was not a calm cove, but high waves crashing against jagged rocks. Fiona walked to the edge of the ledge and seemed to disappear. Ian walked over and found an opening large enough to pass through. The shape of the rock made it almost invisible. Once Ian was inside, she lit 2 torches and grinned. We could use electric flashlights, but that seems sacrilegious. Follow me. We walked about 30 feet before a passage into a huge cavern opened up. The sound of falling water could be heard in the background. Fiona raised a torch above her head, and it illuminated her a bit before disappearing into the impenetrable darkness. Here we are, the last refuge of Garioch. We are across from the city itself, and this land has belonged to my family for centuries. No one knows who discovered it, but it became very convenient when the Viking raiders showed up. The men would bring the women and children down the cliff, and they would take shelter here. Then the men would stage a gunfight to attract their attention and disappear into the interior of the island. Usually, the raiders would loot whatever they could take and then shell the village before leaving. Look to the left. There were inscriptions on the wall, layer upon layer of names and dates carved into the stone. The oldest one I saw was 1103, some written in obscure languages. Fiona looked at him grimly. It's a tradition going back in time. Well, you've seen the dates. It's the name of every woman and child who survived because they could hide here. There's a spring, a good supply of clean, sweet water, and they kept enough supplies in the hiding place to last a month. They didn't leave until the supplies ran out, or the men called them out of hiding. Look here. She led me to another section of the wall, again modeled with names and dates. These are men and women who died defending their families. Let's go. She led me to a far corner, and I was amazed at how large the cave was. A stone couch stood there, and on it lay the skeletal remains of a woman, her bones frozen in her resting place. This is Agnes of Garioch. She died leading the defense of this place the one and only time it was discovered by the Vikings. They always kept sentries, and those sentries heard their approach. You saw how narrow the entrance is, and they fought them off with bows for 5 days until they ran out of arrows. Then they fought their way in, where they were met by women and children 12 years of age and older, armed with maces, daggers, and spears. 43 women and 19 children fought the Viking warriors to the last man. The men, returning with part of the raid, came down from the cliffs and attacked them from behind. Not a single raider was able to get out of Scotland. The village captured 2 of their ships and the treasure they had looted before coming here. They took the ships out into the ocean and burned them and threw all the bodies into the bay in front of the cave. If you were to dive underwater, you might find an artifact or two, but the sea is so treacherous that you risk life and limb. Agnes was the last to die, taking 2 raiders with her. They built this chair and decorated it with necklaces and rings taken from their enemies. According to local legend, she watches over us now. The treasure is still intact, beneath the sediment that has settled on it. No one would risk her wrath to steal it. When did this happen? As far as we can tell, around 1096. When the Luftwaffe bombed nearby air bases and towns, many took shelter here. Look at this. She raised the torch again, and I saw it. Agnes Wallace, Jane Wallace, and Harold Wallace, 1944. My grandmother, mother and brother. I stood, stunned, trying to let the history of this place seep into my bones. If these walls could talk. Then I realized they were speaking, through names and dates. Ian stood beside me, enjoying the look on my face. Look here. Ian, don't... She managed to mumble before he raised the flashlight. It was a wall of names, female and male. What's this? When a local woman wants to marry or make her intentions known, she writes her name and the name of the man she's interested in on this wall. Other women would see it and know the man claiming them. I can show you great-grandmothers from 300 years ago, all the way back to my grandmother. Fiona looked a little embarrassed when I asked where her name was. It's not there. Maybe it shows that I knew what we had wouldn't last. If I ever write my name on the wall along with the name I was meant to have, it might as well be written in blood because it will be for life. I admired the place for a few more minutes before we left. When we got back to the top, she asked me one more time to assure me that I would keep her secret. You don't know me very well, Fiona, but I never betray a trust or share secrets. If people find out about this place, it won't be from me. She looked me in the eye. Good enough. For your information, the cave is strictly a woman's place. Men in our parts usually only get to see it once. They respect that custom, and the cave holds the memory of brave men and women over the centuries, many of whom have died keeping the secret. I grinned. I will keep my word, but you know it would kill me to think of all the books I could write about this place and how many times it has been seen. Next chapter. Ian walked ahead of us, stopping every now and then when something interested him. We talked about him, about how proud she was of him, how she hoped to get him into a prestigious boarding school. She noticed me frowning and asked. I shrugged. Different cultures, I guess. There aren't many boarding schools in my country, and they're mostly military academies. If I ever have children, I want them to be as close to me as possible while they're growing up. She thought for a moment before changing the subject. I'm worried about my grandfather. So am I. But we have to face facts. He's almost 80, and his dream took a lot out of him. Nevertheless, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. How many can say that they actually sailed through the Northwest Passage? When we get back, I'd like to show you something. I'll make the same request of you that you made of me and ask you to keep it a secret. I think you will like what you see." That evening, after everyone had settled down, she knocked on my door. I had already set up my laptop and sat her down in front of it. Soon she was snorting, and when the clip ended, she was crying, huge tears. She settled into my arms and gave what can only be described as a good cry, and then pressed herself against the wall and fell silent. I showed her some footage from the trip. Some of the footage was very powerful. One in particular stirred her. It showed her grandfather at the helm singing Northwest Passage during a storm, with rain and snow whipping him and the wind rubbing the sails. The voyage was on a sailing vessel, built after the pattern of those in use at the time. Besides the sails, it had an engine, but so did Franklin's ships, although those had steam, and this one had diesel. Global warming had melted the ice to the point where travel was possible, and many had already taken advantage of the passage. Still, the journey took 10 weeks. Along the way, stops were made to visit historical sites, including the island where Franklin was supposed to be buried, though no one knew exactly where. Historically, the failure of the voyage has been covered many times, with countless expeditions being sent out to find out the fate of the crew, so the producers touched on it very lightly, just enough to set the stage. I spent another 3 weeks before I had to leave. By then, the Commodore was almost bedridden, and we had many conversations, most of which I wrote down. Fiona and I grew close, though we never really crossed the line. It was very hard for me to leave, and I was surprised at how tightly Ian hugged me. He became my wanderlust buddy, and we made many long treks over rocks and marshes. He and Fiona accompanied me on several short trips for research, and I enjoyed his amazement at what he saw, both in museums and in the field. Fiona seemed to cling to me a little longer than usual. I made them promise to visit me over the summer, and they promised in return to come as often as possible. I went home, but from my study window I often looked out on the lake, watching the boats, especially the sailboats. I finished the novel, and in my preface, gave credit to the Commodore for his historical knowledge. The book was my most successful to date, and the fight for video rights almost made my agent faint, to use an old-fashioned term. Fiona and Ian gave me a very nice call, especially about the dedication. It was dedicated to them and read, "This book is dedicated to Fiona and Ian Wallace," I used his mother's name, she took it over after her divorce, "for their contribution and support." Fiona could well have been the mother of modern corsairs, and Ian would have been a famous sailor in another time. The tradition lives on. Next chapter. Winter was just beginning when I received another call from Fiona. She was crying so hard she couldn't speak, so Ian took over. "Grandpa has died. We need you to come home." I didn't pay attention to it at the time, but as I reflected on the airplane, I remembered his words, "Come home." We talked at least twice a week, and he became a bit of a celebrity when the book came out and the dedication became a household name. They met me at the airplane, hugging me like their lives depended on it. We got back to the estate and I started making calls to fulfill his last wish. He wanted to be buried at sea with full naval honors. He also wanted a traditional burial. His unembalmed corpse would be sewn into a shroud with weights and sent into deep water. At the morgue, his body was frozen at his behest, awaiting instructions. The Commodore was actually a captain, and the Admiralty did a splendid job. He was taken out to sea in a small naval vessel, with a guard of honor, a few old veterans who had served with him, and his family. There were no reporters or camera crews, just sailors and family, and he went into deep water in his dress uniform, with the medals he had been awarded sewn into a dark blue shroud with yellow stars. The shroud was weighted by 3 symbolic cannonballs. After the chaplain concluded the ceremony with the traditional phrase, "We commit your soul to the deep," the plank he was on slowly tilted, and he slipped into his final resting place. Fiona and Ian threw the wreath into the water as the ship's cannons went off, the traditional salute to a sailor. He was buried in the cove of his home, and if you looked up, you could see his estate from the water. The whole town and many people from the countryside lined the streets as the procession made its way to the harbor, and the boats were lined up so thickly that you could almost walk along them to the shore. The Commodore was much beloved and considered a national hero. When his will was read, he left Fiona and Ian everything: house, property, and money, which was much more than expected. He left Ian all of his naval memorabilia except one, a naval saber that had belonged to his great-grandfather, an officer in the mid-1800s, with which he had fought in many famous naval battles. He left it to me. He left me a little note. I never had a son, but if I had one, I would like to think he would be a man like you. So please accept this with my gratitude. I would ask that after you pass away, if you have no sons, that Ian gets this. It should stay in the family. I protested, but my words went unanswered. Keep it for yourself. It meant a lot to him for you to have it, and I'm sure it will stay in the family. They seemed out of place. So after arranging to take care of his possessions, I took him home with me. A few days turned into weeks. Something had to be done about Ian's education, so I put him in a private academy that was highly respected. It took a while, but he got used to having a lot of boys and quite a few girls under my feet on weekends. Even at 13, his fiery red hair, natural good looks, and instinctive charm had all the girls following him around like lovesick puppies. At times, it was very amusing. At times, it was depressing. Fiona grumbled a little, but having all the kids underfoot brought her out of it. She soon made friends with the moms and became involved in school activities. I was writing something new that required a little traveling, but that could wait until summer. We found semi-homemade bliss and became one family. I was required to attend all of Ian's school events, and when any of the mothers seemed to get too close, Fiona would fix my hand in hers, sending a message. A month after I brought them home, we sat by the fireplace and looked out over the frozen lake. Ian had gone to a movie with friends and stayed the night, so we had the house to ourselves. Fiona fiddled around for a minute before she spoke. Miles, I need to know if you have any feelings for me. Feelings that a man has for a woman? Because I feel like I'm falling in love with you, and I never thought I could experience it again. But you're not giving me any signs, so if you don't, I guess Ian and I are going home. Where are your passports? What? Where are your passports? They're in my room, in my dresser drawer. Get them out, please. Many thoughts raced through her head, but she got them out. Follow me. I took her to my bedroom and put them in the safe. Here. Now you can't leave, at least not until you go through the process of getting new ones. It took her a second, but a smirk spread across her face. Then she plopped me down on the bed. We woke up at the same time and Ian came home early. You're back early. Yeah, Brady was sick, and his mom thought it would be a good idea to bring me home. She said she called, but you guys never answered. Probably still on the charger. So is it contagious? Brady was the younger brother of Mike, the friend he'd spent the night with. She doesn't think so, but she figured it was better to be safe than sorry. Where's Mom? I waved my hand in the air. Oh, she's around here somewhere. Why don't you go see if she's on the deck? His eyes widened and he grinned. On the deck. Yeah, I will. I turned and saw Fiona standing there looking horrified. Go take a shower and get dressed. I'll talk to him. What would you say? I would say that you know how things work. I'll also tell him that I respect you very much and will not tolerate disrespect. He'll either accept it or he won't. But you saw him grin. I think he agrees. She disappeared into her room and I went out on the deck. Ian was sitting there watching the boats, turned and grinned. So you and your mom. Yes, me and your mom. Is that going to be a problem for you? He couldn't hold back a smirk. Not if it works out the way I think it will, but it's going to cost you money. My mom and I want a sailboat. They talked about it in generalities. I think it was partly a way of gauging how much I wanted them to stay. We'll have lunch at the club and I'll make some announcements. He shrieked and played the hornpipe the Commodore had taught him. Ian didn't realize that he had also taught it to me. We were just doing high leg kicks, hands on hips, and then Fiona appeared, filming the dance on her phone. We didn't miss a beat, got her attention, and saluted at the end. She laughed and cried in equal measure, arms spread wide, and we hugged her as tightly as we could. As we let go of each other and collapsed onto the street furniture, Ian exclaimed, Mom, Pa, Miles is going to buy us a sailboat. I said we'll look at sailboats. We'll look at, corrected me gently. Fiona's face lit up with pleasure. You will learn, my dear boy, that when a man says to his woman and his child, let's see, it means the deed is pretty much done. Pleasure pierced me like lightning. The next day, we went to the yacht club for Sunday brunch. I wasn't a member, but I knew a lot of the club, and I had no trouble wrangling an invitation, especially when I said I was looking for a yacht. Fiona looked regal, to say the least, with Ian standing at her full height. I had a feeling that if we stayed together, I'd be overshadowed, but that was fine with me. We sat at the governor's desk, at his insistence, after he found out who Fiona was. Your grandfather had a good reputation, Miss Wallace. He was and is sorely missed. She thanked him, and they began discussing her grandfather's latest adventure, sailing the Northwest Passage. I smiled as I remembered the documentary that was to be released the following month. A significant portion of the movie was dedicated to her grandfather. In the closing scenes, he stood at the helm in a storm, his long white hair and beard fluttering in the wind. You could barely make out his words until they were overlaid with a version created especially for the movie. It is performed by Fiddler's Green, a very popular Irish band. We asked several bands to submit their versions, and the producers, me, liked their version the best. The final scene is a rear view where he is struggling with the helm, keeping the yacht on course. The vocals were powerful as the screen faded to show his name and date of passing. After a late breakfast, we took a walk around the harbor, and he showed us several vessels for sale. I noticed that Fiona was not impressed. Then we went into his office, and he showed her several vessels for sale locally and in the southeast. He showed her one and started leafing through it. This one. I wasn't versed in yachts, but the governor told me later that this was the best of the lot. A 38-foot yacht with clean lines. It even had a stateroom, and the sofa could be turned into a bed. It was a little grander than I expected, but although I owned the bank, Fiona seemed to have the keys to the vault. We looked it over, and I wrote a check. By then it was summer, and we were spending an inordinate amount of time on the water. The sails could be hoisted with electric motors, but they were almost never used. I became a pretty good sailor in good weather, but if it got rough, Fiona or Ian would take the helm. Fiona and I often went out to sea alone. We were anchored in a sheltered bay, so everything was fine. Later, I wondered if the explosions I heard that night were caused by a thunderstorm or the dormitory. It just so happened that it was that night that I gave her the ring. She went pale for a second, and then the explosions went off. Next chapter. Before it happened, we went to Canada for the premiere of a documentary. It was a private screening, mostly for the cast, crew and their families, and a few invited guests. I didn't expect there to be more than 400 people. Before the movie started, we were all given a small book each chronicling the voyage and listing everyone involved in the project, from crew members to technicians, who were needed to make the movie. There was a picture of the Commodore on the cover. There was also a flyer asking if you liked the movie to join the cast and crew to stand last watch for Captain Wallace at the end of the movie. I deliberately didn't say anything about the movie to Fiona and Ian because I wanted to get their genuine reactions. That may have been a mistake. As the movie went on, she became quieter and more still, holding onto our hands so tightly that I felt the blood stop circulating. When the end credits came on, she broke into huge sobs. The movie theater became quiet. Then one man stood up and began to sing along in a high, clear tenor. Others stood up 2 and 3 at a time, and those who knew the words sang along. Military veterans in the crowd stood at full strength and saluted, holding their salute until the end. I held Fiona in my arms and saw Ian standing upright on the rail and saluting even as his tears flowed. The cameras zoomed in on him as the song ended. When the lights came back on, all the people in the theater walked past Fiona and Ian, hugging them, patting them on the back and offering condolences. One diminutive woman, who must have been in her 80s or so, really got a grip on her as she hugged her and stepped back. Old sea dogs never die, dear. They just go on a new voyage. One day you'll see him standing at the helm and welcoming you aboard. The production company set up video cameras and recording equipment to film this as a tribute to Fiona and Ian, but then asked permission to put it on YouTube, partly as a mark of respect and partly to promote the movie. When the film was released, the BBC and most American channels showed clips of people in theaters standing up and singing along. The movie had a particularly big resonance in Canada when it was learned there that Nathan Rogers was part of the crew. His father Stan had written the song Northwest Passage, and it was so popular in Canada that it was considered the second national anthem. Nathan Rogers participated in a bit of traveling and still talks about it in his concerts. There is a segment where he sits with many of the crew and sings old sea songs. There was a Channel 4 documentary about Captain Wallace, and I was listed as the biographer. The movie included many conversations I had recorded, all of which were carefully reviewed before permission was granted, and a year later, a movement arose for his image to be featured on a stamp. Next chapter. When we finally got back to our room, as she immediately fell into a deep sleep, Ian and I sat for a while and I asked him what he thought. I think I wish I had been with him. Since he lived in the States, I didn't get to spend as much time with him as I would have liked. But when I was around him, I hardly ever left his side. He was a real man, wasn't he? He's the stuff of legends, son. You have a great legacy ahead of you. The next morning, Fiona got up before we did, and I found her sipping tea on the terrace. Are you okay? She smiled, but it was Van's smile. Yeah, just a little dazed. I don't think I mourned him enough. My father was away a lot, and he's the one I consider my real parent. Then she sat on my lap and snuggled up to me. I should thank you. You never told me, but the documentary film crew informed me that you funded the expedition, saying you wanted it filmed, and most firmly believe it was only to give my grandfather his dream. Words cannot express my gratitude. I did it because I could, and because I knew how much it meant to him. He'd been trying to organize this for years, and I was just in the right place at the right time. You thought enough of him to spend $12 million on his dream. I'll never forget that. I really hated that she knew how much I'd spent. I could well afford it, and the projected numbers said I'd make a good profit. But truth be told, even if it was a failure, I'd do it. We spent 3 weeks on the estate, after which we returned home. Ian was once again immersed in the joy of his youth, caring for his parents and a bright future. Thanks to my condition, he would never have to work if he didn't want to, but I knew he would have some kind of career. He just wasn't programmed for idleness. Money was talked about when she got the ring. I don't need your money. I have my own income, so I'll never be destitute. I only grinned. You don't need my money, dear. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to invoke the TFB provision. What the hell does that mean? It means too bad. You're going to get the money whether you want it or not, and then it's going to go to Ian. Off topic. She was still trying to make noises as I walked away. My parents, brothers, and sisters adored Fiona and Ian. As soon as they became acquainted, my mom started dropping hints. Fee and I talked it over. I was 39, she was 36, and we both decided it was best not to have children. She had had a difficult labor with Ian, and the doctors urged her not to have any more babies, saying she could, but it would be very dangerous. She cried a bit about it. I've always wanted a daughter, and I'd love to have her with you. I waited a year before offering her an alternative. In the meantime, we got married. Twice. Once in the States, once in Scotland. It was important to her, so I didn't mind. 3 days later, she disappeared for a while and came back grinning like crazy. That night, she showed me a photograph taken in a secret cave, with her name and mine imprinted on it, next to her grandparents' names. You're mine for life now, darling. Sit. You didn't have to carve it in stone to make it real, but I admit it's a nice touch. Next chapter. The next book was something out of the ordinary for me. It was a biography of Sir Winston Stone Wallace, the captain. That's right, the Commodore was a lord of the Scottish aristocracy. He once laughingly told me this. In the days when my ancestors ascended to the throne, you could practically claim lordship just for wearing your pants properly and having a few pounds to contribute to whatever war was raging at the time. But, to their credit, my ancestors were glorious misers. It was a small book at 185 pages, but I felt I had covered all the important points. The book did reasonably well and sold much better in the UK and Canada than it did domestically, but I didn't care about profit, only meaning. I dedicated it to Ian and his mother. To my son, Ian Wallace Molson, and his mother, the love of my life, Fiona Wallace Molson, honorable descendants of a proud and noble family. Ian came to see us shortly after the wedding, wanting to know if I would adopt him so that all our names would be the same. He was surprised at my answer. You must realize that nothing would make me prouder of you, but I must remind you that you are the last of the Wallace family. If you take mine, the line will cease to exist. If you still want it, we'll start the paperwork tomorrow. Fiona hugged me tightly, and a solution emerged in her finely tuned brain. Since I married you, my name has been Fiona Wallace Molson. I've decided to legally change my name to Wallace Molson in honor of my grandfather. Ian can do the same. That's exactly what we did, although he goes by the surname Molson at school. That winter, the yacht club organized a Christmas flotilla. Each boat taking part had to have working seasonal lights. It was connected to one of their charities, and you didn't have to be a member of the club to join, but you had to pay a fee. Fee and Ian took part in this in a big way. They even ran garlands up the mast and set up a life-size Christmas tree on top. We used the engine, so the sails stayed down. Then they started helping others, and one of them was Darla. We saw each other at club events because my family insisted that we join the club. She and her husband joined the club, and even though he was an attorney, he seemed like a decent man and was into sailing. For their third wedding anniversary, he gave her a new boat, almost a replica of ours. They had been married for 4 years, and Darla had just given him a son. She was a little old for a baby, but they carefully monitored her health, and she gave birth to a healthy boy. That was why Fee and Ian were helping her, as she was still recovering from the birth. They acted a little distant at first, until Darla talked her into sitting down for a cup of coffee. Look, you know who I am. I know who you are. I know he met you a few years after we broke up, so you're not a replacement. You're his wife now. A good wife, by the looks of it. We were young and stupid, at least I was. And when Miles succeeded, I let myself go. Do I regret not doing it? Sure, for a very long time, until I finally realized that I couldn't go back to the past and had to look to the future. I dated some pretty bad losers for a while, and was about to give up when I met Rick. I told him all about our breakup, and he said that the actions of a stupid girl shouldn't reflect on a mature woman, and if he didn't think he could trust me, then we wouldn't be dating. I couldn't put his ring on my finger fast enough after that. Now I'm happy, and I'm sure you are too. She then chuckled. Is he still like a kid in a candy store in bed? Worse. But you like it. Am I right? Very much so. He makes everything fresh, and I have no idea what he's up to from day to day. It gives me a lot to be excited about. So I'm his past. You're his future. We've never crossed paths. You might be interested in becoming friends. Fee hugged her. I see certain possibilities. She told me this later, 15 minutes before Darla knocked on our door. Are you sure you're okay with this? It'll only be for a few hours, and I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to it. Being able to have an adult conversation without having to pay attention to his crying will be heavenly. Oh, hey, Miles. I was just leaving. She slipped the baby carrier into my hands, kissed Fee on the cheek, and left. I looked at the sleeping infant. What was that? She grinned. Oh, I didn't tell you. We babysat so Darla and hubby could attend his company's Christmas party. They won't be back until midnight at the latest. Give him to me. It was an order, and I obeyed. Ian and I smiled as she rocked the baby, cooing to him in a soft voice. Then she had Ian hold him while she warmed the bottle and fed me. Practice for our grandchildren and learn from this. It was fun, but when he was done, I handed him to Fee and she walked him around, rubbing his back until he regurgitated and then curled up in a fecal ball. Typical. What goes in, comes out. Get the diaper bag, sweetie. Ian took one sip and ran off. He smelled like toxic waste, but Fee only smiled as she changed him and then told me to get rid of the used diaper. I carefully held him by one corner all the way to the trash can, and Fee giggled. They returned a few hours later, and Darla was giggling like crazy. Fee took one look at her, grinned, and told me to go make coffee. Rick walked behind me and looked back to see them sitting on the couch together, whispering and smiling. I wonder what they're talking about. You're a lawyer, right? Been married long? You probably already know that the first thing married women talk about is their husbands, then their children. When those topics are exhausted, they move on to the next one that's always on their mind. He looked a little shocked, but then grinned. She's just been authorized to return to her wifely duties, as she put it. I just hope Junior sleeps long enough to let us get reacquainted. I had to smile. Leave him here. Darla brought a bag with enough formula and diapers to last a month. I wouldn't pry, but Fee's a great mom and she'd destroy for the chance to keep him. Really? Yes, counselor, really. Go home and try to make your bed. I don't think Fee slept that much, constantly checking on the baby. I got up one day to see her looking down, rubbing her cheek, tears in her eyes. It was time to talk. For a few days, Fee hung around doing nothing, but then she got distracted by the Christmas flotilla. A lot of money was raised to make Christmas better for many disadvantaged families. We had a good time. After we got home, she looked depressed. We left the young lovebirds in front of the big fireplace and retired to the den with instructions not to leave the room. He's growing up so fast. Soon he'll be off to uni and we'll have an empty nest. I grinned. I wanted to talk to you about that. I know we've decided against natural childbirth, but they don't have to be domesticated. There are plenty of children in the world who need a loving home. I'd like a daughter if we decide to adopt. I don't think a boy can compare to Ian. Tears glistened in her eyes. If we have a boy, you'll love him as much as Ian. Are you sure? How small do we have to be? I don't mind a newborn or even a teenager, but I'd like to keep them longer. Do you think? I think I should have broached the subject earlier. I vote for the less the better. I've even made some suggestions. We'll look into it after the holidays. I think those were some of the best holidays in my memory. Then Ian came over and wanted to talk. I've been thinking about this a lot. I want to follow in my grandfather's footsteps and become a naval sailor. I'd like to go to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth as soon as I get my undergraduate degree. In order to do that, I need to go to school. So I guess what I want to ask is if you would send me to boarding school so I would be ready to enroll. Is that really what you want? I've thought about it a lot. It's really what I want. I really, really don't want to go to boarding school, but I don't see a way out. Let me try to think of something. Fee wept quietly, lamenting the fact that her nest had been emptied too soon. There was no doubt that we would do the right thing. And the right thing was moving back to Scotland. Fee wasn't tied to any career, and all I needed was a quiet place and a laptop, and I could work anywhere. We gathered for a farewell dinner with my family, and there were quite a few tears. Then one of my nieces asked if I was leaving Brenda. She immediately traded me for Fiona as the one she loved the most, and Fee laughed about it, stroking her under the chin and whispering something to her. The inconstant bitch was eating it all up. Jen was higher on the affection scale than me, and we almost renamed her Sea Dog because she seemed to like the boat. She'd stand on the bow, splashes wetting her, and her lips folded into a doggy grin, and it was like that until we went ashore. Sorry, Chrissy, but she's leaving with us. The yacht club threw a big party to celebrate our departure, although I explained that we would definitely be spending most of the summer here. Darlene and Fee had become good friends, and as they said goodbye to us, they cried the whole time. 2 days after the party, we closed on our lake house and swam across the pond. Next chapter. Ian enrolled in a premier school that he could attend while staying home, and soon the young beauties were smitten with the tanned, muscular teenager. Several parents were pushing their daughters toward him, hoping for a lucrative marriage. Fee laughed at my outrage. It's a worldwide habit, I'm afraid. Marriages of convenience still exist in one form or another. I guess some customs never die. He and the 3 girls accepted it and flaunted their friendship in front of their parents. I worked, releasing one novel and plotting another. I wrote about every other novel with a nautical theme, which people responded well to. I got a taste for it with my book about piracy and profiteering on the South American coast. One critic called me a more sophisticated Clive Cussler, which was quite funny and completely inaccurate. I met Mr. Cussler, and his love of the sea was an order of magnitude beyond anything I could have imagined. We hit it off to such an extent that he invited me to go on a historical research expedition through his foundation. He had discovered and raised several shipwrecks, and I could name only one person who could match him in knowledge. The Commodore would have been in awe of him. I think he considered his greatest accomplishment the raising of the Hunley, the first Confederate submarine. I had a deadline and couldn't go, and a few months later I read about how he had found and restored 4 historic cannons used in the defense of New Orleans in 1812. I sent him a beautiful wreath when he passed away and seriously considered writing a book about some of his exploits, but decided to put it off until a little more time had passed. We had considered adoption while we were in the States, and were now repeating the process here. I was starting to get frustrated with the whole process when suddenly Fee came back from town with 2 cars in tow. Out of them stepped 3 men wearing clothes that screamed government official in any language. 2 more casually dressed ladies got out of the other car, opened the back doors, and pulled out 2 packages. The packages contained twin girls who were just over 2 years old. They looked confused, frightened, and not at all happy. Fee led everyone into the living room, a place we rarely used, more to impress than for comfort. I stepped out of the study, and her smile could have galvanized half of Scotland. And here he is. I'd like to introduce you to my husband, Miles. I called everyone by name and shook hands, still perplexed as to what was going on. By this time, Fee had both girls on her lap, cradling them in her arms. Honey, these precious little girls are named Kara and Florence. Their parents were in a nasty accident, and they are alone in this world. I'd like to fix that. They stayed there for 3 hours while we filled out a huge amount of paperwork. Finally, the woman in charge shook my hand. Congratulations! You have become a father on a temporary basis. These girls have been placed in your custody with the prospect of full adoption. We will check on them regularly to make sure they are being properly cared for. I have no doubt that this will be a happy day in these children's lives. Both Lady Fiona and you have an excellent reputation in the community, but protocols must be followed. You will be under the microscope, so to speak, but we have no doubt you will be up to the task. We wish you good luck and all that. Then they left. Fee looked at me and grinned. Congratulations, dear. It's a girl, or in this case, girls. Then her face turned serious. I know this is unexpected and a bit of a shock, but I took the opportunity. Their parents died in a boating accident. They have no close relatives, and they had to go into foster care. When I heard the news, I immediately went to their office. For the first time in my life, I used my lordship position for something other than charity. Please don't be angry. By this time, I was already holding Kara in my arms and quietly rocking her, feeling the fear leave her little body. Fiona was cradling Florence, tears streaming down her cheeks. This is unexpected, but wonderful. So hang in there, old girl. We have a long trip ahead of us. By this time, the girls were asleep, and we gently tucked them in. Then she melted into my arms, and tears of happiness streamed down her face. Ian came home and heard the story. By then, the girls were awake and wandering around the room, and soon became infatuated with him, wanting to follow him wherever he went. I thought it was hilarious, and he loved it. It took about 6 months before they realized that he was their big brother, and they would wait at the door when he came home from class and chase each other for 15 or 20 minutes. They couldn't pronounce the word brother, so they started calling him Bubby. It was another year before Kara ran into my office screaming, "Pa! Spider! Spider!" Florence stood right behind her with huge eyes and grabbed my hand. The big spider was tiny, but it was in their toy box and had to go. Fiona laughed as I picked it up and carried it outside. I talked to the girls, telling them that we shouldn't hurt them and that spiders have a role in life. They calmed down, but still wouldn't go near him. When they went back to their playroom, Fiona came up to me. "I love seeing you smile when they call you Daddy. They started calling you Mommy after only 2 months. With me, it took them 5. That tells me something about my situation. You know, when she has a choice, Kara prefers your lap. She's going to be a daddy's girl. Florence seems to prefer me, unless she's afraid. Then it's all you, Spider Winner." Almost a year after we got them, they officially became Florence and Kara Wallace Molson. Ian graduated from high school and went to Edinburgh University for the engineering program. His entry was easier than I had anticipated. The college was ranked 16th in the world, but he was a legacy going back 2.5 centuries. His subject of study was sustainable energy, and he usually got very high grades. During his studies, he converted almost all the buildings on the estate to solar and wind power, always available because of living by the sea. He graduated with honors and almost immediately enrolled at the Royal Naval College. Once again, he had an inheritance. Normally, it took 39 weeks to complete the course, but he went for a few advanced classes that took him to 50. When he stepped on stage as an officer, he was holding the sword that the Commodore had given me all those years ago. When I handed him the sword, he was very emotional. "I can't take this." "You can and you will take it. It deserves to be at your side to carry the legacy forward. You don't think the Commodore gave it to me for safekeeping, do you? He put it in trust for me to pass it on when that moment comes. You will have to bear the burden. History will weigh on you. And I am sure that when the time comes to pass it on to your son and daughter, the burden will be even greater." Polished to a shine, the hilt gleamed in the sun. He had come home on a short vacation before his first tour of duty on a ship patrolling the North Sea. His duties included installing solar panels and small wind turbines on the ship to reduce energy consumption. His designs proved so successful that he was moved from ship to ship installing systems. The girls were now 8 years old and clung to his legs when it was time to go into service. He sent them postcards from exotic places and small gifts. They wrote him long letters detailing everything that had happened since their last letter. I thought things would calm down a bit when they became teenagers. What an idiot I was. Teenage stress, periods, boyfriends, dates that kept me up until they came home, driver's license. I seriously considered sending them to a convent. Then there were the good times. The touching, the adventure, the traveling. It was all worth it. My father passed away suddenly, and my mother was left destitute, so we brought her home to visit. In the last 6 years, she has traveled to the States 4 times for major family events, mostly for her grandchildren's weddings. She took the girls out for the summer, staying at our old lake house. Fee and I enjoyed the freedom for about a week. Mom liked being considered the grand dame of the estate, and she adopted the local customs and manner of speech fairly quickly. The only time the veneer slipped was when she and the girls came across a woman bullying a small child. Her heritage kicked in again, and the woman couldn't do anything to counter the redneck. Her mother literally kicked her ass, and it took the girls and 2 constables to pull her away from the woman. She was charged with assault and disorderly conduct, whatever that was. The woman was charged with child abuse, and she turned around and sued the mom, seeking damages. Things are a bit different in Scotland, and at first the mom laughed and said let her go. She had nothing of value to take. Then I persuaded the woman to make an out-of-court agreement for a small amount, which she immediately spent in the pub and other places, quickly going broke. They took her baby and Fiona interceded, so the girls had a baby sister of about 18 months. During this time, her mother underwent counseling courses on reckless behavior, anger management, proper parenting techniques, and alcoholism. When she completed the course, Alicia was returned to her. Alicia really didn't want to go back, but we had no choice, and both my mom and Fiona got it into her head that she needed to call immediately if things went back to normal. 3 months later, she called her mom and whimpered. Her mom had gone into a drunken rage, and she was hiding out at a friend's house. We were instantly in the Land Rover, calling emergency services on the fly. They arrived at the same time as us, as did her mother, who was standing in the street screaming in a drunken rage. The emergency personnel took one look at Alicia and arrested her mother. Since we were foster parents, they released the child to us, and we took her home. She left after going to university, after seeking through the courts to change her name to Alicia Agnes Wallace Molson. Her mother did not authorize the name change, but when she came of age, there was nothing she could do about it. There were 2 women, 2 teenagers, and a teenager in the house, and I preferred to stay in my office as long as possible. That plan never worked because one or the other always had some problem that required my presence. The only family member who wasn't demanding was Angus, my sleek collie. Brenda, a mighty sea dog, had died at 13, which was quite a decent age for her breed. Ian was very upset because she had definitely become his dog. We bought a beautiful stone for her and buried her on a hill above the sea so that the salt wind would always be to her advantage. It was 6 months before we decided to get another dog, and we visited kennels and the best breeders in the area. The girls fell in love with Highland Terriers and got one each. Ian found a deerhound at a shelter and immediately bonded with her. I found Angus at another shelter. He was a 3/4 smooth-haired collie from a registered half-collie, half-mutant dog, and so the breeder went bankrupt and the litter was donated to the shelter. Fiona found a female golden retriever that she just had to have, so she always had a dog underfoot. Fiona was a skilled trainer, and she soon had the pack in order. All the dogs loved the outdoors and needed good exercise, so once a week and every weekend, we spent time on the trails with the dogs running up and down, in addition to the children spending time with them. Angus was more than happy to live in my office, and the terriers slept with the girls if we let them. The deerhound preferred to sleep outside in his box, even in the worst weather. The retriever slept at the foot of our bed. No one ever snuck up on us because Stag, the deerhound, let everyone know we had guests. When Alicia and Mom showed up, the pack was augmented with a couple more dogs. Alicia got a border collie, and Mom got what you might call a mongrel. He was huge, and even the deerhound recognized him as the pack leader, and God help you if he thought you wished Mom harm. The twins graduated from the Scottish equivalent of high school and decided to go to different universities. Cara chose St. Andrews. Florence chose Aberdeen to get her medical degree. 5 years later, it was Alicia's time. She surprised us all by choosing Oxford. Just before Alicia left, I began to notice changes in Fiona, strange personality quirks I hadn't noticed before. I think she was controlling herself for Alicia's sake, but when she left, Fee seemed to go off the rails. She threw tantrums of epic proportions and got violent a couple times. I think my mom's death might have triggered it. She died quietly, in her sleep, at the age of 76. Fee found her when she didn't come down for breakfast. We took her home, laid her ashes next to Daddy, and then flew back and put what little we had saved in the family plot so that a piece of her would always be with us. It was her wish, and it pleased Fiona immensely. I tried to talk to her, tried to reason with her, but every month it got worse. When she flew into a rage and I caught her with a gun, I'd had enough. I made one last attempt to persuade her to see a doctor, but a tirade of profanity made me give up. She looked at me with venom in her eyes. "Tomorrow, I'm going to the cave to get your name out. I want nothing more to do with you." It broke my heart, but I took her at her word and left the next day. Fiona called 2 days later, berating me for not being home and demanding that I return immediately. That's not going to happen. I love you more than words can express, but I refuse to sleep with one eye open waiting for you to snap. Not if, but when you agree to get a physical and a couple of counseling sessions, I'll be back on the first plane. Until then, I'm fine where I am. She yelled at me as I passed out. I called all the kids individually to let them know what was going on. They had all noticed the change in their mother, but had no idea it was that bad. I instructed Florence as the doctor to visit Fiona and see if she could make any sense of what was going on. I checked into the lake house for a couple days. Then I bought an Indian Chief motorcycle geared for traveling and hit the road. I called the kids to tell them what was going on. Then they told me what was happening on the home front. Ian got an emergency vacation, and the girls picked him up at the airport. Florence was found on our bedroom floor, holding our wedding portrait. My face had been ripped to shreds, and a large knife lay beside her. She called emergency services and was taken to a local hospital and then transported to a larger facility. All the kids immediately dropped what they were doing and gathered at the hospital. When Kara called me to tell me she was in the hospital, I was already on the next plane. It turned out that my dear wife had a whole combination of problems that seemed to be triggered by menopause. I talked at length with specialists. She has a serious hormonal imbalance and needs surgery to remove her thyroid gland as soon as possible. She also has breast cancer, but it is at a very early stage, and we will probably just have to remove a few lumps and then monitor her closely. We are also recommending intensive therapy because, as your daughter has told us, she may be a danger to herself and others. I was shocked. She was sedated when I arrived, and I stayed by her side for 20 hours before Kara and Florence took over. I got a suite and slept in it for 7 hours. When I got back, Ian was there with Alicia. They're going to bring her out of sedation and want us there when she wakes up. She came out slowly, her eyes unfocused. When she could recognize me, she whimpered and held out her arms, and I hugged her, and the kids piled around her, touching her as often as they could. Fiona was getting the supplements she needed to keep her hormones balanced, had thyroid surgery, and was going to counseling. Kara was a little angry at me for leaving, but her mother quickly calmed her down. I wasn't myself, baby. I was seriously thinking about killing your father there at the end. He did the right thing to leave, and it was the shock I needed. His leaving may have saved us all. A few months later, she had surgery to remove the cancer, and now she is checked every 6 months like clockwork, but nothing else has turned up. Counseling was very helpful, and I went with her almost every time, which she seemed to need. The years went by. Ian married a Spanish woman he met while serving in the embassy. His sea life seemed to be behind him. She was glad he was now on land. There had been a small outbreak in Africa, and he had been assigned to a small ship to patrol the border. They were attacked, as it later turned out, by pirates, and the pirates quickly realized that it was one thing to attack an unarmed cargo ship, and quite another to fight someone who had superior firepower and was more than happy to use it. They blew the pirate ship apart, literally. Out of a crew of 26, there was only one survivor. Ian conducted an interrogation, and when the man confessed that they were government-sponsored and had to give 50% of their income to the government, things got interesting. The man named names, and suddenly the small country faced the full wrath of the British government. As they were told in Britain, they were at war. Special forces units banded together and conducted several successful raids on pirate strongholds, completely destroying 3 of them and then burning all the ships in the harbor. The Navy blockaded the coastline and trade was banned. This country had long been a thorn in the side of many nations, and the U.S. supported it by escorting cargo ships past the coast. 2 raids were attempted, and both were met with extreme brutality, and checking for survivors was not suggested. An invasion plan was discussed, and riots broke out in the major cities demanding a change of government. Faced with internal and external pressure, the country surrendered. The regime was immediately replaced and was monitored by an international committee. In recognition of his role in debunking the dictatorship, Ian was appointed military liaison to the committee, and when he foiled an assassination attempt on the U.S. and British ambassadors, he was promoted and awarded medals from both countries. Among them was an American captain who had done as much as Jan, and they received their medals together and became lifelong friends. Sometimes their friendship was utilized by both countries in matters that were not to be publicly discussed. As my family watched Ian receive his medals, his hand still in the ligature, I thought of the Commodore. He would be very proud of his grandson. The incident led to his new appointment, and when the ambassador was promoted to Spain, Ian went with him at his request. He met his wife at a ball hosted by the embassy. When he proposed, he brought her to the estate, and she became close to all the girls. The service was conducted by the ambassador, also a retired naval officer, under some obscure law that allowed him to speak at weddings. The Spanish bishop was also present to make sure everything was legal from her father's point of view. They honeymooned at the lake house, and the yacht club hosted a reception for them. They considered Ian one of their own, and being able to show off a couple from two different royal houses was just on point. He took her to meet members of my family, and though she wasn't sure how she would take them at first, they got along just fine. She took all the cousins her age and younger on a shopping trip to New York, and by the time it was over, they would have killed for her. I'm sure Conchita loved having Ian home all the time. He helped them a lot with their two sons. When they got older, we took them for a few weeks every summer, and they enjoyed spending time with their cousins. Florence works at the local hospital, and we fear she is married to her career, although she brings a very pretty nurse with her to family dinners. Kara has gotten her degree, but she doesn't use it. She spends her time chasing after her three children. Alicia surprised us by moving to the States to get her graduate degree. She lives in a lake house, but flies home as often as she can. She is in a relationship with another PhD candidate, but I don't see a future for them. I think she told him that if they ever got together, he would have to move to Scotland, and thus nipped their relationship in the bud. I'm still writing, even though I'm in my 70s. Most of my books sell well, although I'm not as successful as I used to be. My grandchildren insist that I tell them stories, and I have written one children's book for children under 10 and another for younger teens, and both are selling very well. Fiona is the grand dame of the estate, and even at her age, she is still involved in village life as a children's services advisor. We even do short-term fostering, but we are too old to take on another child permanently. I decided to donate the ship I fitted out for the documentary, Terror 2, to the Royal Navy. It is now moored at the local naval dockyard and is a tourist attraction. We go down to it from time to time to feel the sound of the waves and reminisce. With my permission, the ship was renamed and is now called the Captain W.S. Wallace. 2 summers ago, we rented a large cabin cruise ship in Maryland and traveled the intercoastal waterway all the way to Florida with the 2 oldest grandchildren as crew, and then met up at Disneyland with the rest of the family for a week before heading home. All the children and grandchildren gathered at the house to celebrate Grandma's 70th birthday. We had a tradition of watching a documentary about their great-grandfather at least once every time we all got together. Then we showed clips of Kara and Florence as teenagers, dressed in sailor suits, doing the hornpipe dance during various mountain games. They have a whole closet of trophies for this and sword dancing. All the grandchildren learned this dance, and we always danced it together during family celebrations. Then Ian would sing sea songs for them.